Chapter 51, The Investigation 2. She had him there. By all evidence, Sifo was a close friend to Dooku and an integral part of his operations at the new temple. The Jedi Master's death had caused Dooku no shortage of headaches in its immediate aftermath. But somehow Voss just couldn't shake the feeling that it had to be the Count. He had to be involved somehow. His holocom rang, almost startling him. After a second ring, Voss answered. Even through the blue projection of the holocom, Luminara Unduli looked tired. The Jedi Master had spent the better part of a week on Raxus Prime, which was not conducive to good rest for a Force-sensitive. The constant simmering of the dark side had worn on all the Jedi who went to investigate the murder, leaving even the strictly orthodox Miri Allen worn and disheveled. Her normally immaculate headdress was creased, like she hadn't hung it up properly before going to sleep in the morning and just threw it on without bothering to iron it. "Any progress?" the Jedi Master asked, without a hint of a formal greeting. After he was silent for a moment, Ayla answered instead. "No. The palace security record is clear, Dooku was here the entire time. So was his apprentice. Neither of them had access to his ship. His reason for sending Sifo to Raxus checks out." Voss let his Padawan go on, not quite ready to admit that he was wrong just yet. After she was done, Voss turned the question around. "What about you? Any new information on your end?" Luminara scowled. "Possibly. We found a witness." "That's great." Sifo returned a rented speeder to the stand right out front from the shipyard, and we found the boy manning the counter at the time of the explosion. "What's the problem, then?" "There's three. 1. He was running a side business as a spice dealer selling glitter stim. 2. He was using some of his own supply at the time of the explosion. And 3. His testimony is contradicted by the physical evidence." Voss clicked his tongue in frustration. "How much of a contradiction?" "He claims Sifo was outside the ship at the time of the explosion, when we found his remains on the bridge." "Great." Voss grunted, frustrated. "It gets worse." Luminara hesitated, before adding, "He claims he saw Sifo get attacked by another Jedi before the ship exploded. One with a red lightsaber. Which we don't have a body for, despite supposedly being caught in the blast." Voss' brow crinkled as he considered the implication. "A Sith. They were extinct." "I know. It sounds impossible to me." Luminara. "His testimony would be worthless before a court, and I'm not even sure if we can draw any leads from it. So dead ends in every direction." Ayla concluded. "Yes, Padawan, it seems that way." Hesitating slightly, Voss decided to ask another less tactful question. "And the new temple Jedi? Priyala. Anything suspicious there? Trying to cover something up maybe, or hide evidence? Anything that could link a Jedi from the new temple to the crime scene?" Luminara scowled. She disappeared completely. No one from the investigation team heard a word from her, until she showed up again 3 days later with Sifo's missing lightsaber. Where'd she find that? With local security. They stole evidence from our crime scene and tried to pawn it on the black market. Priyala also learned that planetary security was involved with the Black Sun, so she just arrested half the precinct with their own cuffs. All she's managed to prove since arriving is that our crime scene was completely contaminated before we even boarded the ship on Coruscant. Force be with us. Ayla groaned. 1 step forward, 10 steps back. Voss summarized. There are no conclusions we can draw from our investigation. Luminara shook her head slightly, seeming disgusted at the words she was saying. Sifo died in an explosion that originated from his ship. It's still possible that this was the result of an accident due to a malfunctioning plasma reactor. At the moment, I have 2 leads left. And those are. Sifo's ship was insured. If we can find out who last serviced it, we might be able to rule on whether this was an accident or not. That's not very promising. Secondly, if you can use your psychometry on Sifo's lightsaber, we can determine if he was attacked by a Jedi assassin or not. Oh, no. Ayla sighed. We're going to Prime. I'm afraid so. Luminara answered. Finish up there and come back here. Voss hung up, irritated. After a moment of silence, Ayla spoke up. A malfunctioning plasma reactor would explain some things. Like, How Sifo never detected the explosives on his ship, or sensed that someone was plotting to kill him. It would fit the available evidence. And the witness's testimony? He was high at the time. He could have seen anything. Glitter stims weren't known to make people hallucinate, Voss knew, but the witness could have had some other spice in his system or maybe a pre-existing condition. Even the general population of Raxus was known to be crazy, the kid could just have undiagnosed schizophrenia. Well, we better get back there. Ayla suggested. I don't think we can achieve much else here. Not just yet. There's still one more person I want to talk to. Who? His student. Ayla looked like she thought that was a dubious idea, and Voss didn't blame her. Tanya was only 7, and it was doubtful she had any knowledge of the incident at all. Even talking to her was in poor taste, given that her teacher had been killed and she was likely grieving. But despite the mounting evidence, Voss still wasn't able to shake off his suspicions towards Dooku. Come on, don't tell me you aren't interested in the prophesied one. Maybe helping our investigation will be how she tears that veil. That only made Ayla look even more uncertain. The two Jedi eventually agreed to talk to Tanya, setting off towards the looming presence in the Force. They didn't need to ask for directions. Ever since they set foot in the palace, Voss and Ayla could feel the little girl no matter where she went. If Voss had to guess, the girl was at the stage of her training in the Force that she was learning to grow her connection, and hadn't yet mastered it enough to shrink her presence. Among Jedi, it was seen as rude for those more powerful to leave their power completely unmasked. It was unnecessarily intimidating. The closest point of comparison Voss could find for the girl's power was Yoda. On the rare occasions the Grandmaster revealed his full potential. They found her in what was presumably her bedroom, and after a moment of consideration Voss stepped aside so Ayla could knock. He suspected his apprentice would be much less intimidating to the child than he would be. After a few moments the door opened to reveal an ordinary, 7-year-old human girl. She had dark hair that she kept only at shoulder length, and was wearing robes appropriate for a youngling. Hello there. Ayla said in a kindly voice, crouching down so she was at eye level. We're investigators from the Jedi Temple. We just want to talk to you a little bit. The girl's eyes narrowed at that, her expression settling into a scowl that looked like a pout on her face. Does father know that you're here? Talking to a minor without their guardian present must be against procedure. Ayla turned to look at Voss, her eyebrow raised. We're not here as part of the investigation. Voss lied, but given this conversation would never end up in his report, maybe it wasn't really lying. We just wanted to meet you. Oh. In that case, I have nothing further to say to you. The Brett then stepped back into the room, and closed the door in Ayla's face. Maybe the Force preserve whoever was stuck as master to that awful brat. Shaking his head, Voss knew there wasn't too much he could do. He could not interview a minor in an official capacity without a parent or guardian present, and if she didn't want to talk to him privately there wasn't really anything he could do to force her. At least, not while the most powerful swordsman in the entire order was right downstairs. Ayla stood back up, and turned to her master. Well, if that's everything. I guess it is. Voss agreed, and together they left for their ship. So this is your scheme, being X. Surveying her room, she glared at the books on the shelf and the dolls arranged on the windowsill. She expected that voice to come from somewhere, anywhere, but all the objects remained inert. You think this is enough? You think this is how you'll get me to bow down to you? She stood up, too full of energy to sit still. She paced restlessly, waiting for his mocking demands. I should have seen it coming. Of course this is what would happen to anyone I grew close to, wasn't it? Where was he? She searched the room again, not finding any sign of the monstrous entity. Giving me the silent treatment now. Pretending you've forgotten about me. But I wouldn't be here without you, X. I know you're watching. Now that I have a family, and friends, you think you can threaten to take them away. Lips curled into a snarl, she spun on the spot, waiting for being X to appear, yet seeing him nowhere. Eventually her gaze settled on the mirror, the sweet young face of a pampered, powerless princess staring back at her. A grimace of hateful wrath bloomed across it as she jabbed a finger at her reflection. I've had enough. Mark my words, being X. One day I'll be powerful enough to make you bleed. And you'll never be able to take anything away from me ever again. Chapter 52, The Funeral Eye. 32 BBY. Across her 3 lives, Tanya had only ever been to one funeral, decades ago as a boy, before he had ever heard of the Chicago School of Economics. His father had even briefly managed to escape the black company he worked at for a few hours to bury the woman that birthed and raised him, before rushing back to the office to escape his supervisor's ire. Tanya recalled not particularly understanding the graveness of the occasion, having never really met his grandmother. This upcoming funeral was different, it felt different. The atmosphere was palpable. Tanya could sense the strength of her mother's emotions, worry for her husband and daughter mixed with the determination to be strong, even as grief swelled inside her. Tanya's father was concealing himself in the Force, the weight of his emotions hidden behind a mental shield and a steely gaze, though Tanya knew this must be difficult for him. Of course, Jedi weren't supposed to be attached, but expecting that of a friendship and near brotherhood that stretched over decades was asking for the impossible. The bond between brothers in arms was nigh universal, and no amount of Jedi brainwashing could change that. Tanya remembered that conversation she had with Grandmaster Yoda on Life Day, all those years ago. Of course it was natural for him to feel grief when Jedi he had raised from childhood died in the course of their duties or even just from old age, but he had put on a brave face and marched to work the next day. It was admirable, really. Tanya knew that as the Grandmaster of the new temple, her father could not allow himself to mourn openly. He was a Jedi, he had a duty to do, and so he had focused himself on the diplomatic fallout that Sipho's death had caused, as was appropriate for his station. If anything, his facial expression often seemed to lean towards anger more than anything else, something Tanya could understand with the way the Grand Temple had sent those 2 incompetents to poke around the palace. Had Yoda really approved of those 2 being on the investigative team? She had to presume that was a decision made by one of his subordinates. The Jedi Temple employed roughly 10,000 Jedi, and Tanya couldn't think of any CEO who would micromanage something so far down the chain. No doubt when her father went to speak with the Jedi Council, he would be issuing a sternly worded report on their behavior. Tanya herself was committed to be on her best behavior for the funeral service, the very model of a good youngling. She had even asked her mother's help in picking out an appropriate set of formal black clothes for the occasion, and even wore a long skirt with the cape and silver chain that marked her as heir. With her face schooled to neutrality befitting an officer, and her feelings in the Force concealed behind her own mental wall, Tanya would not be the one to embarrass the family or the new temple. This was the first time she would ever visit Coruscant, and she regretted it was under such unfortunate circumstances. A world-spanning city was an intriguing concept, something she almost found difficult to believe could exist. The sheer amount of food needed to feed so many trillions of people was only estimated by scholars of the subject, and the amount of sewage they put out was just as incalculable. In a way it was beautiful, being irrefutable physical evidence of the power of the free market. Supply met demand, and so the wheels of civilization continued to turn freely. In the earliest days of the Republic, when the Rakatans still dominated the galaxy, Coruscant hadn't been anything of note at all. It was merely one planet populated by humans among a handful of others clinging to the coattails of the Duros. Hyperspace travel slowly developed, and exploration continued across the galaxy, eventually leading to the chartering of the great hyperspace lanes, of which Coruscant sat conveniently near the center. Coruscant was uniquely positioned at the convergence of the Perlmian and Corellian trade routes, and had indirect access to the Rima and the Hydian as well. On Earth, all roads may have led to Rome, but it was no exaggeration to say that all hyperspace lanes led back to Coruscant. Situated where it was natural, inevitable that Coruscant grew as vast as it did. Some theorized Coruscant was the world that humans originated from, a theory that Tanya dismissed. From her memory, Earth was located near the edge of the Milky Way on one of its arms, and Tanya assumed this galaxy was merely the future of that, or maybe another alternate timeline like in her second life. Most likely, the lost human homeworld was somewhere in the outer rim, where there were plenty of ancient populations and cultures out there unnoticed by the galaxy at large. When they had been working on their book together, Tanya had proposed her theory to Sipho, and he thought it was very plausible. He believed that human populations had been spread around the galaxy as slaves by the ancient Rakatans, who had outlived their masters when the Infinite Empire collapsed. He even theorized that the galaxy's many near-human races may have originated from the Rakatans tampering with human genetics, an idea that was controversial in academic circles. Now the series would never be finished. Tanya couldn't help the melancholic sigh that escaped her. Sipho's magnum opus had been cut short part way through Volume 4, covering the Mandalorian's wars. It really was a shame. Even with Master Sipho's greater emphasis on military history, Tanya had found the process of working together on the books with him to be very enjoyable. The discussions they would have, the narrative strings that naturally emerged, trying to balance different themes and ideas and learning about these remarkable figures in history, like Revan and Exar Kun. Tanya had been intrigued to begin research on Mitra Surik, who had single-handedly revived a near-extinct Jedi Order. Of course, being X had taken even that away from her. That petty tyrant masquerading as a god could never let go of his grudge against her. He even told her that her second life would be her last, and had very clearly failed to heed his own words, that promise. Clearly, driven by sheer spite, being X was determined to torment her for all eternity unless she put a stop to it. Tanya clenched her jaw, watching the streets of Coruscant pass below her window. "Are you all right, Tanya?" her mother asked. Tanya didn't need to read her feelings in the Force to know she was obviously worried. "I'm just thinking that Sipho's book series is never going to be finished." For some reason, that simple statement provoked such a sense of sympathy in Tanya's mother, that she put her arm around her daughter's shoulder and hugged her closer. It was embarrassing and annoying, but also completely ordinary for a mother to be worried for their child. After putting up with it for what she felt was an appropriate length of time, Tanya pulled away, to continue looking out the window of their speeder as it passed through the countless traffic ways and intersections that crisscrossed the world's entire surface. It was a fascinating place. Tanya wasn't usually one to be driven by whimsy, but a city on this scale, one that utterly dwarfed even Tokyo from her first life, was something that she wanted to explore. More importantly, the Jedi Temple was in the senatorial district, and it seemed to Tanya like a perfect chance to try and network among the Republic's political class. In the future, when she ruled Sereno, these connections would be extremely useful for getting things done in a way that suited her. "After the service, do you suppose I could take a tour of the Senate building?" Her mother started to speak, but Dooku cut across her sharply. "No, we are leaving right after the service." Surprised, Tanya exchanged slightly confused glances with her mother. "I didn't realize we were pressed for time," Athamine said, finally. "Is something wrong? This world is far more dangerous than Raxus Prime, and Tanya is not yet even a Padawan, let alone a master." "We won't go into the Undercity, dear," Athamine promised. "And we'll take a guide so we don't get lost by accident. The most dangerous beings on this world don't lurk in the Undercity." Dooku murmured softly, and turned his head to look out the window towards the Senate building itself as their speeder passed it by. Chapter 53, The Funeral 2. A whisper in the dark side tugged at Dooku, and he was almost tempted to follow it then and there. Sidious wanted to speak with him, and was calling him away from the Jedi Temple. Whatever he had to say would surely be less painful to hear than to sit with the blasted Jedi Council. With the funeral due to start in a few hours, Dooku had made the mistake of going to speak to them while they were together. Individually, he got along well with many of them, but as a group they were prone to posturing. He had hoped to persuade them on the necessity of sparing a few Jedi Masters to the new temple, just until some of his knights were ready to be promoted, but instead Dooku had been lectured for the better part of an hour by the self-satisfied fools. They sat there in a circle around him, questioning him in phone-neutral tones about if Kai Narek was truly ready for his promotion. Outnumbered 12-1, Dooku had only repeated his answers a few times, before he outright refused to take the same question twice. In his mind he agreed, Kai Narek's dueling skills weren't quite at a level Dooku would accept in a master yet, and he was internally conflicted enough that his connection to the Force wasn't as strong as it could be. If Dooku were still on the Jedi Council, he would have been against Narek's promotion. Now that he was trying to run his own temple, he saw things differently. Narek was a skilled leader and teacher, and had a genuine rapport with the other knights. Dooku needed another master to help him run the new temple. Narek was the best option. So be it. Narek is a worthy Jedi Master. Dooku had to stop himself from growling out each word, lest his frustration show itself. "And if you wish to see his work, I invite you to come visit in Diner yourself." 12 pairs of eyes stared at him from all sides, and though they tried to hide it, Dooku was sure many of them were just as frustrated as he was. Yoda hadn't said a word for the entire interrogation, even though he had to know some of what Dooku was struggling with. At least Yaddle looked somewhat sympathetic to him, while Windu remained unreadable as always. The Council was not a monolith, it never had been. Jedi had different beliefs and interpretations of the code, and this resulted in loose factions that occasionally disagreed on what should be done and who could be trusted with what role. They weren't anything as formal as a political party, but loosely the groups could be described as the orthodox and the unorthodox. The former were concerned with the spiritual well-being of the Jedi, and felt that too much involvement with the affairs of the Republic was corrupting, and the latter felt that the primary role of the Jedi was to serve the Republic, and desired to take a more active role outside the temple. Many considered Dooku to lean towards the unorthodox, though his views were more nuanced than that. For one thing, he agreed that the Jedi should be more active than the Orthodox would like, but he disagreed that the Jedi should be more involved with the Republic, because it was a source of corruption. As far as Dooku was concerned, there should be a team of Jedi working all hours to influence the Senate like the corporate lobbyists did. They could use as many mind tricks as it took to make the collection of absolute fools do some actual good for once. The average senator was deeply mediocre, and should never have been trusted to vote for anything in the first place, anyway. Of what worth was the free will of another fat, self-serving career politician? Better to influence the Senate than be influenced by it. Dooku had seen more than one disaster unfold thanks to some fool's ambitions. Of course, voicing this view in the first place was part of what got Dooku kicked off the Jedi Council, even though he spoke it half in jest. These days he didn't think of it as a joke at all. His patience fully gone, Dooku didn't even wait for the Council's reply after the chamber was silent for a few moments. I see that you will not help me grow the new temple, and I will not demote Narek. Dooku turned to leave. So be it. There is one more thing we wanted to discuss. Mace spoke up. In regards to Master Sipho's passing. Have you discovered the assassin? Dooku asked. No, but the Council is concerned by Sipho's presence on Raxus at the time of his death, Dooku. Mace leaned forward slightly. The Council is confused by the reason for him being there. You have all read the report? Dooku asked, ready to dismiss the whole thing. Priala was part of the team and had shared it with him. Sipho was helping me to refurbish some ships. Your world is not supposed to be purchasing military vessels, Dooku. A fine thing then that I'm repairing ones that I already own. That's the letter of the law, not the spirit of it. Yaddle chided. Yes, well, if the spirit of the law mattered at all, I'm sure the galaxy would be much better for it. For now, my people need safety and I am providing it. Dooku replied. Is that all? Why was Sipho doing the inspection for you? Plo Klun pressed. It would have been more appropriate for a representative of your house to go instead. Sipho was the one who suggested going to Raxus. Dooku said, jaw tightening at the implication. He was even the one who found the ships in the archives, and contracted the engineer. I merely let him to do as he willed. No one here is suggesting you had a hand in his death. Yaddle assured him. But the new temple isn't a tool of House Sereno. We are concerned that you are allowing your private interests to interfere with Jedi business. Count of Sereno, Grand Master of the new temple. Windu added. You have conflicting responsibilities. Yes, much like serving the people of the Republic and the Senate. The Senate represents the people. Mace replied. Dooku scoffed openly at that. The point is the Council feels a mistake was made, and wants to ensure it is not repeated. Ki-Adi said. Well, the new temple appreciates the Council's concerns, and will give them the full weight they're due. Dooku replied, curtly. Will that be all? When the room was silent, Dooku left without another word, fuming. He rode the lift down to the main hall alone, stewing inside himself. How dare they try to lecture him over Sipho's fate after all their failures? A mistake they called it. Of course they were all too happy to overlook their own shortcomings after Galadrin, repeating those mistakes a dozen times over. Master Khatri didn't have to die, and they wouldn't have even realized who murdered her if he hadn't stepped in. They didn't want to change, they were far too comfortable. How many times had the so-called wise council sent Jedi to their dooms? They had the gall to lecture him when he had done it but once. He stood there in place, unmoving as the lift doors slid open. He hadn't wanted Sipho to die. He even tried to avoid it for as long as possible, but in the end Sidious had demanded it and he'd relented. Dooku had even met the assassin in private. Sipho, a brother in all but blood who Dooku had known since they were just boys, had been killed with Dooku's blessings. Sipho had never questioned it. The man was faithful to the end, too faithful. He placed his trust in the Republic, in prophecy, and in the Jedi Council. All of them had betrayed him in the end. Most deserving of the blame would be Dooku himself. He may not have been the one to do the deed, but he might have had. Having stood there for too long, the elevator door timed out and closed in front of Dooku's face, his expression reflected back at him in its foggy surface. Was he angry? Tired? Was this guilt he was feeling? Foolish. Shaking his head, Dooku pressed the button to open the doors again. He strode out into the Jedi Temple, and resolved to ignore that seduction of the dark side. Whatever Sidious wanted could wait. Chapter 54, The Funeral 3. Even among the lax dress code of the Grand Temple, Voss was occasionally frowned at for his choice of attire. He kinda liked it that way. Some called it disrespectful, but he did like needling some of the more orthodox masters on occasion. Today wasn't the right time for that, though. Despite himself, Voss had put on his nice, clean traditional brown and tans with the long-sleeved robes and a cloak that politely hid his lightsaber from view, like he hadn't been raised from infancy as a killing machine. He'd even made Ayla dress the same, despite her protests. Today just wasn't the right day to thumb his nose at the stuffier masters, or work up a sweat on the training mat. They were having a funeral, and it was for a man Voss respected, even though they weren't exactly acquainted. Sifo had always told the council the truth, which of course they didn't like. A reformer, some called him. Not one of those naive ones either, the kind who wanted to move the Jedi away from being guardians, but instead turn them all into gardeners so they could all meditate their way to a pointless, self-satisfied enlightenment. No, Sifo was someone who understood the real galaxy. Sadly, his calls for a more militarized order had only fallen on deaf ears. There was a reason that Voss wore his sleeves bare, and it was simple: he had large, well-defined muscles. The obvious physical power was naturally scary, like an instinctive thing that every human and near-human race had learned in the course of their natural evolution to be wary of. They couldn't help their natural response, it was buried under all those sociable layers of the brain that everyone still shared with insects and lizards. Some birds puffed up their feathers, some creatures might try to stand taller and hiss while baring their fangs, and Voss didn't wear sleeves. Keeping the peace required intimidation. Not too much, but enough that people understood what the consequences of breaking that peace would be. So yeah, Voss agreed wholeheartedly with Sifo's calls for a more militarized Jedi order. A lot of Sifo's talk was about history and precedent, and what else did protectors of peace need more than instruments of war? Too many Jedi ignored his warnings, warding off his wisdom with empty, repeated sayings about the lightsaber that could cut both ways. And besides, they were all connected through the Force in the end, weren't they? Yeah, well, so were the Sith. Now Sifo was being cremated in a closed casket, having been killed by one. Or so it was being claimed. Voss could use psychometry. Through the Force he could see into the past of an object, especially if a Force user had handled it. With Sifo's lightsaber, Voss had been able to get a fair bit, but only after they got it away from the Nexus on Raxus Prime. Sifo had been attacked by someone using the dark side. Not just using it, but absolutely drowning in it, reveling in it. The old Jedi Master was losing the battle until the ship exploded, and then, nothing. Voss tried using his psychometry on the few plasma reactor fragments they recovered, but no luck there at all. Probably whatever sabotage had been done was carried out by a droid, so no traces in the Force. The ship had been almost annihilated by the blast, its pieces scattered into a junkyard, only making it harder to figure out what actually happened. At least they were now certain this had been an assassination. With the investigation team there to support her, Master Luminara had delivered her report to the rest of the Jedi Council, and in response they had done what they do best: nothing. Luminara had elected to omit Voss's belief Dooku had been involved from her report, so he had decided to voice that view himself. Even if Dooku had an alibi, there were plenty of other Jedi at the new temple who could have carried out the attack. That hadn't gone over well. The room had been dead silent, until Yoda quietly asked him to leave. And now, here they all were at the funeral. Honestly, Voss was surprised he still got an invite. Despite the grim occasion, Voss noticed the obvious different groups among the Jedi attending just from their choice of clothing alone. Everyone had come in their best, and had revealed to everyone the divides between them all by what they considered formal wear. The Jedi of the Temple on Coruscant, with some outliers, had come dressed in brown and tan robes, symbolizing their connection to the people of the Republic. Sifo had spent some time with the Green Jedi, and so a delegation had arrived from there dressed in their traditional colors. They were the smallest group, wearing boots cut in that flexible Corellian style that was popular with travelers, and wearing so much gold jewelry that Voss wanted to know how they could fight with all that extra weight. There were also some guardians of the wills present, in unmarked red robes, and even a creepy Tipo paladin in a face-concealing mask and dressed in grey. The real show stealers were the Jedi from the new temple on Indiner. They wore black capes and trousers. Scandalous. They looked a bit like Dooku, though none of them were exactly wearing his Sereno style, and each had their own small touches, like piercings or cuffs. Standing at the front of them was the Count himself, with his wife and bratty eldest child beside him, all stern-faced. You'd think a kid would be more choked up, but no, she was doing her best impression of her dad. Less like her teacher died, and more like she was annoyed that somebody had farted near her with her nose raised up in the air. Honestly, Voss had to respect the balls on Dooku bringing his whole family here. That had caused some stirrings among the more orthodox Coruscant Jedi. To have a wife and children was against the code, but at least Ki-Adi-Mundi left his family at home where they belonged. Here Dooku was, flaunting his disregard for tradition in the dismissive way he always had. If he wasn't pretty sure the man was a murderer, Voss might have respected him for it. Behind Dooku, there were all the faces of the new temple, some of which Voss recognized. Arrayed like this, he was noticing how different they looked since he'd seen many of them just a few years ago. No longer did they look like scared, unsure social outcasts, bitter young men and women without a cause. Now they stood straight, with color in their cheeks and a light in their eyes. Even here, at a funeral, they had energy and purpose that Voss never remembered seeing before. Kai Narek and Asajj Ventress were also around, and it was there that Voss was sure he found the answer to the question posed by the health of the new temple. Asajj demonstrated Kai's skill as a trainer, and his ability to connect with those under him. On Coruscant, there were rumblings that the former knight was definitely not ready for the rank of master, but Voss could see his leadership skills. The new temple, even with only the 20 or so knights present and just 2 masters, demonstrated a strong sense of community and unity without even realizing that's what they were doing. Voss thought it was just like the council to give those 2 to Dooku. Asajj and Narek should have been here on Coruscant, strengthening the next generation rather than luring it out to the Force knew where to serve the 12th Lost Master. He wasn't a historian, but hadn't at least 2 separate Sith empires been founded that way? Master, this is a funeral. Ayla murmured to him below her breath, chiding. Yeah, he knew that. Shifting his gaze to where the neatly arrayed scaffold of oil-soaked firewood sat in the center of the courtyard, a closed wooden coffin perched atop it. The blue skies of Coruscant hung overhead, the airspace above the Jedi temple crowded with speeders. Voss imagined a small child, watching out the back window of a vehicle as the Jedi conducted their service. This was a funeral for a Jedi. There were no long speeches, nor was there any overt crying. If someone felt grief over a Jedi's passing, they were to meditate on it in their own time. No one even played an instrument. Voss watched as Yoda slowly hobbled his way to the funeral pyre, before using Sipho's own lightsaber to set the wood ablaze. The assembled friends of the dead watched as the smoke rose from pyre, disappearing into the sky above the city. The only sound anyone could hear was the crackling of wood, and maybe the rustle of robes as someone nearby shifted their weight. Anyone who had gas was clenching it in, that's for sure. When the fire burned out, someone would come along to sweep up the ashes and clean away the tiles. Thus ended the life of a Jedi Master. Come to think of it, what Kai been doing for all those years he was missing? Voss' gaze shifted back to the freshly minted Master. How could a Jedi ever be trapped on a world without a hyperdrive? Why would he even go there in the first place? What were the actual chances of finding a random Dathomiri there? His gaze settled on the Count's Padawan, and for a split second their gazes met, a scowl on her lips. A plan began to formulate in Voss's mind. Chapter 55, The Funeral 4. Asajj had decided she didn't like Coruscant. To her it reeked with the smell of burning dust mites. Humans couldn't really smell it, and neither could the other Zabrak she met, but to her it was ever present on the city world. She wondered if her nose was just unusually sensitive, or if other Dathomiri had a similar sense of smell. Even in the heart of the Jedi Temple, Asajj couldn't get the taste out of her mouth, and feared that even after she left the planet she'd have to replace her robes to get rid of the stench. Not to mention the planet's presence in the Force. The nexus that surrounded Coruscant was drawn from the countless thoughts and feelings of the teeming swarms of sentience that infested every crack and crevice of this miserable world, with the overriding emotions being ambition and anxiety. Here in the heart of the Order, the Jedi radiated peace and confidence, which mingled with the feelings of those outside, leaving the Force gritty with an unresolved mix of warring emotions. Asajj wasn't sure how to describe it. It wasn't quite cold like the dark side, but it was still foul in its own way. Asajj would prefer a jungle of trees over one of Duracrete. Even having someone merely explain to her the nature of Coruscant's undercity left her feeling unsettled. Any beast that crawled out from under a rock on Sereno wouldn't be half as translucently pale and sadistically cruel as a deranged gangster that slunk up from the tunnels of this world. What were the Jedi even doing here? If the filth of the Undercity were to ever try and force their way to the surface, to plunder the towers raised above their heads, there'd be nothing anyone could do to stop them. This world was like a thin coating of glamour and wealth painted over a foundation of misery and helplessness, perched precariously over a sucking pit of outright chaos. No one even seemed to notice or care, too caught up in their desperate daily scramble. She couldn't wait to leave this place. Being here had only taught her to be glad to be accepted by the new temple and rejected by the old. She was reminded of that particularly whenever any of the Jedi here stopped to watch the Night Sister as she passed, like she had any real connection to that cult. Following the example set by her current master, Asajj pretended not to notice. With her shoulders back and her chest puffed out, she stalked through the corridors like she owned the place, and found its upkeep lacking, the latter being hardly an exaggeration at all. Dooku was right to leave this accursed world, and should have done so sooner. One could say what they pleased about the Mudavin diner, but at least it was peaceful. The new temple was growing there, and attracting settlers to seek security in its shadow. More and more farms were springing up in view of the temple garden, spreading cultivated rows of green shoots and grazing herd animals. There was even a fishing trawler that started to cast nets in the slurry flats, dragging in hauls of those strange native crustaceans that thrived in the oceans of muck. They even tasted okay too, once the cooks figured out the trick of running cold water over their backs for a few hours to get them to pass out the mud inside them. A little bit of a cheesy aftertaste, but that wasn't so bad with the right peppers. Not to mention she actually knew her way around the new temple. Going somewhere? A man suddenly asked her from behind, voice a rough growl that nearly made her jump. She turned to regard the speaker, and scowled immediately upon recognizing him, though she took a moment to remember his name. Voss. He was that thuggish Jedi that grilled everyone at the palace on Sereno for days, including her. Particularly her. After they left, the royal guards had even reported that Voss and his Padawan had gone as far to try and talk to poor little Tanya unaccompanied. Thankfully the clever girl had sensibly sent them away without saying anything, but that this fool would even try to speak to a child who had just lost a mentor and close friend really spoke ill of Coruscant Temple's tolerance to the conduct of its knights. I can go where I please. Asajj answered, primly. Even the council chambers are not off limits to me. There were a few places where Padawans weren't allowed to visit at will, like the Holocron Vault, but she wasn't anywhere near those. At least she didn't think she was. This place didn't have any blasted signs. Voss nodded, regarding her with a lip quirked in amusement. Asajj glanced past him, and realized his Padawan wasn't with him. What do you want? She asked, suddenly suspicious. Help. From you. She narrowed her eyes disbelievingly. Why would I help you? Because you're going to do what's right. She scoffed. You think helping you is the right thing? Not always. This time though, yeah. He smirked. Walk with me. You were lost anyway. Asajj opened her mouth to deny it, but stopped herself because of how obviously true it was. Anything she said would just be an excuse that made her sound like a fool. He didn't wait for her answer, striding away towards a set of doors, and after a moment of hesitation Asajj walked after him, frustrated but curious. What was his game? What do you think of Sipho's assassination? He asked her. Have you read the files? I'm a Padawan. She didn't have access to those. Fair enough. Voss then explained the circumstances around the Jedi Master's death. His strange presence on a dangerous force nexus due to Dooku's private affairs, the premeditated nature of the attack and how Sipho seemingly had no warning, and the fact that before he died he was attacked by a yellowed-eyed Darksider with a lightsaber. What do you think? He asked at the end. You're searching for a dark Jedi hiding in the new temple. They would have access to Sypho's schedule, so they would know when he was heading for Prime. They could plant the bomb on his ship when it was parked on Indiner, and they have lightsabers. She paused, and shot an annoyed look at the men. And it explains why you're so interested in me, the Dathomiri. Does it? The Night Sisters are a well-known dark side cult. Asajj scowled. You're trying to pin this on me. I'm trying to catch a murderer. Voss replied. If it's you, then I want you, but if it's not you, I want your help. They walked in silence for a few moments, as she turned the story about in her head. Let me ask you this. Voss looked back at Asajj. Would an assassin attack Sypho, then set off the bomb? You're assuming that the assassin planted the bomb, and that Sypho had no warning he was coming. Asajj kept her mouth shut, not saying anything at all. What if Sypho had plenty of warning about the assassin, and he was the one who planted the bomb? Voss paused, then added. He was a seer. Her brows came together, and she considered his theory. It fits. It wasn't that Sypho was lured to Prime, but that Sypho lured the assassin there. If I wanted to attack a Jedi Master, I wouldn't want to do it when he's protected by other Jedi, especially not Dooku. The assassin followed Sypho, waiting for the chance to strike, and chased him from Sereno to Prime. Asajj smirked. Meaning my master had nothing to do with it. Voss shrugged. Maybe. So what did you want my help with? Asajj asked. Or did you really want a Padawan to hear you speculate without evidence? I want you to help me find evidence. You want a spy. Asajj sneered at the men. You want me to betray my master, and the new temple for you. The whole funeral you were giving us all stink eye. Why was Sypho killed, Asajj? We need to know. He looked at her. If there's a dark sider in the new temple, corrupting it, then it could be another galactic war. They could just as easily be here, in the Grand Temple. They could be, which is why I'll search for them here myself. Voss replied. But I'm not part of the new temple. I don't have access to it, like you do. Well, I won't help you. Asajj declared, firmly. Find another knight to do your dirty work. What are the chances of finding a lone, Force-sensitive Night Sister slave on a world without hyperdrives? The change in topic was so sudden it took a moment for Asajj to understand what he was referring to. What? Voss said, folding his arms. How does a Dathomiri from Dathomir get to another world? A ship, obviously. Asajj snapped back, sarcastically. But I thought Ratatak didn't have access to hyperdrives. Asajj opened her mouth and closed it, feeling a strange pit opening up in her stomach. Frozen on the spot, she tried to think of an excuse, but couldn't find any. If it was impossible to leave Ratatak due to its isolation from hyperdrives, how could she even have been traded there in the first place? Voss smirked. Narek is full of it. How could he, a Jedi, possibly be stranded just because his ship wasn't working? His story doesn't add up, he's lying. He's not. Asajj growled, clenching her fists. He can't be. Search your feelings. He reached behind himself, and took out a holocom before pressing it into Asajj's hands. It's prepaid. My number is saved on this. He turned and strode away, saying over his shoulder. Message me when you find answers. After he was gone, Asajj looked at the device in her hands. Voss was clearly a nasty piece of work, and he was trying to manipulate her. The thug wanted to hurt the new temple, and Kentucky. The only reason he approached her and not one of the others was because he thought he had strings to tie around her. She was a Padawan, and so of course he thought she would be much easier to control for her age. If she had any sense, she'd throw the bloody thing away right now. She knew it. But just having it didn't mean she had to use it, did it? Asajj grit her teeth before stuffing the comm into her belt pouch and hurrying away. She'd think about it later, she was too hungry to focus on it now. Somewhere in the back of her mind, a silent, long-suppressed voice snickered. Chapter 56, Phantom Menace I. 32 BBY, The Invasion of Naboo. The twin sons of Tatooine made the sands of the desert writhe and squirm with heat waves, even as Maul's fever made him feel like he was burning up from the inside. His skin was tender and swollen, with cracked scabs oozing into the bandages wrapped around his back and neck. The inside of his robe and the seat of his chair was slick with a mix of pus and sweat. He would have passed out hours ago if it wasn't for a Sith technique he was using to ignore his body's needs. The Bacta injections and bandages he kept on the infiltrator just weren't enough to deal with the burns, not after his wounds had been soaked in the filthy rain of Raxus Prime. Weeks later, they were still swollen and infected. His vision occasionally swam, not just from the heat outside the ship, but a hazy knife of unconsciousness that tried to force its way through his iron will. All he had to keep himself going was his hate and anger for that damned old man. The Jedi Master had been warned, why else would there be a bomb on his ship? That Count had told him, he must have. When Sidious was finally done with Dooku, Maul would cut down him and his entire brood. Maul's vision was swimming even as he grit his teeth and shook his head. Forcing the weakness out of his mind, if not his body, Maul tightened his grip on the armrests of his chair as his probes rushed over the dunes of Tatooine. He needed immersion in a Bacta tank, and time to recover, but there was no chance of that. Before he had the chance to fully heal, his master had called with a new mission, one that couldn't wait. This moment was important. Too important to wait. Sidious had long been preparing for this, the culmination of a lifetime of political maneuvering. Everything on Naboo had to go perfectly, and Maul had to make sure of it. He couldn't refuse Sidious. If he did, he would need to give a reason why. Need to admit that the paranoid old man was ready for him, waiting. Maul hadn't been cautious. Hadn't been careful. Maul had challenged the Jedi directly, honorably, like a Sith of old would. Of course the Jedi scum would betray that challenge in a cowardly way. How could he tell his master that he nearly died? That his skin was seared by plasma fire that he only barely kept at bay with the Force? A Sith did not survive by displaying weakness, especially not to those they would one day attempt to usurp. If it hadn't been for the power lent to him by the Force Nexus, Maul would have been incinerated. Luckily, it hadn't seemed like Maul would need to do much on this mission. The Trade Federation would blockade the planet, invade its surface, capture the Queen, and force her to sign a treaty in an afternoon. Maul would spend the whole time meditating and nursing his strength, only there in case something went wrong. Then the Nemoidians had bungled. The Republic had sent 2 Jedi, the Viceroy panicked, and tried to kill them. The Jedi escaped, freed the Queen, and managed to flee to Tatooine before Maul was finally called in to fix their mess. One of his probes issued an alert. Darth Maul opened up a connection to it. In binary, the drone warbled a few notes of a report on a Naboo cruiser it found parked outside the city. Maul was relieved. No doubt, that was where Queen Amidala was. Sidious' orders had been to eliminate the 2 Jedi first, but now that he was on this scalding cesspit, dripping with sweat even inside the shelter of his ship, he wondered if he really could face the Jedi Master and his Padawan together. At full strength, it would be a challenge, but as he wasn't sure he could defeat them together. Whatever Sith techniques he used, his reactions were still slowed, his muscles weakened by the infection lingering in his lungs and lymphatic nodes. Gritting his teeth, he was forced to admit it wouldn't be wise to challenge the 2 directly. If they separated, he could try to pick them off individually, but for now he would just have to focus on his true objective, Queen Amidala. Sidious would not be impressed by Maul passing over a battle with the Jedi, but he had more important things to focus on right now, like seizing the position of Supreme Chancellor. The 2 Jedi were a side objective, and Maul just wanted to get off this miserable world. No point in waiting around when the opportunity was right there. Without hesitating, Maul took off in his infiltrator. He circled around above the city, locking onto the parked ship with his jamming equipment. He briefly considered just blasting the ship to pieces on the ground, but decided against it. It wouldn't do for him to assume the Queen was aboard, only to learn later that she'd somehow escaped. His scanners revealed about 24 lifeforms aboard the ship, but with only a few blasters among them. Only one lightsaber, so the Jedi had separated. Maul switched on the scimitar's autopilot, before dropping the rear ramp and leaping out. The dark side howled in his ears as he slowed his descent, before crashing directly on the bridge of the ship. This was no graceful Jedi touchdown, but a Sith call to battle. Durasteel bent and warped outward from him in rippling waves, leaving a misshapen crater in the nose of the ship. The pilot in the chair looked at him shocked, a middle-aged man with a receding hairline and his hands at the controls. He was probably trying to figure out what was causing his dropped signal. Either way, the pilot was fast enough to throw himself out of the way when Maul plunged his lightsaber through the transparent steel screen. The pilot scrambled to his feet and ran down the corridor as Maul carved his way aboard the ship. Maul's ship signaled to him that people were trying to flee the cruiser, and he sent an order to blast anyone who tried to flee, as well as deploying some probes to circle the area and give warning if an unlucky stranger dared to interfere. Stalking forward down the ship's hull, Maul detected a mind lying in ambush just in the next room. The dark side revealed to him a blaster, and fear, barely kept in check by determination. Guided by the Force, Maul threw his saber staff forward to slash through the men and the tight corner he was hiding behind, feeling his mind wink out. In the tight confines of the ship, Maul didn't have much chance to use both of his saber blades, but found no real challenge in the few who tried to stop him. Most of them weren't even soldiers with blasters, but pilots and handmaidens armed with anything sharp or heavy they could find. Mind after mind winked out in the Force, and Maul felt little satisfaction as none of them were his target. His ship's computer reported that it had blasted at least one group that had tried to flee, but after seeing the blaster shots raining from above, the ship's passengers had hidden in the hangar bay. Feeling a fearlessly determined mind up ahead that was trying to rapidly calculate an escape, Maul suspected he'd finally found his target in the Queen's private chamber. He hit the switch, and the door hissed open. Maul barely heard the blaster shot, which he deflected back at its source on reflex. The shooter was a woman in her mid-20s with her face painted white and her hair raised in elaborate rolls and curves. The Queen of Naboo collapsed in a smoking heap, the air in the chamber filled with the smell of burning skin and clothes, her mind disappearing in the Force. Smirking to himself, Maul turned to leave back the way he came, only to feel another approaching. This wasn't another one of the palace militia, but a Jedi, and from how frantic his thoughts were, certainly the Padawan. A master would be more in control of himself. Maul hesitated. The Queen was dead, he had accomplished his main mission and could leave now. Then he scowled, realizing he would be running away from a Padawan. The shame of it was too great, the weakness it demonstrated. This method of attack had been cowardly enough. A true Sith craved the chance to test his strength, and Maul would not back down from a mere learner just because he wasn't at his peak strength. Maul stepped into this level of the ship's connecting hallway, and waited with his lightsaber drawn. At the other end of the ship, coming up from the engineering deck, came a blue-eyed, brown-haired human man in his mid-20s, wearing the tan robes of a Jedi. He looked at Maul, then passed him to the Queen's bed chambers, before his face set in grim determination. Without a word he drew his own lightsaber, burning blue in the hallway between them. Chapter 57, Phantom Menace 2. At the other end of the ship, coming up from the engineering deck, came a blue-eyed, brown-haired human man in his mid-20s, wearing the tan robes of a Jedi. He looked at Maul, then passed him to the Queen's bed chambers, before his face set in grim determination. Without a word he drew his own lightsaber, burning blue in the hallway between them. Maul smirked, raising his lightsaber. Rather than ignite both ends, he held it in front of himself with just one blade. There was no reason to give this whelp a maneuvering advantage in the tight confines of the ship. Rushing forward, Maul used the additional length of his lightsaber hilt to stab at the Padawan from a distance while keeping his own body safe. Ably parrying the attack in his Sorisa form, the young Jedi took a step back, eyes focused on the Sith. Maul almost wanted to roll his eyes, but didn't take his gaze from his foe. Another Jedi who foolishly clung to Sorisu. This would be even easier than the old man had been, before he cheated. Maul rushed forward, both hands on his lightsaber as he quickly slashed again and again at the Padawan's torso, changing speed and tempo as he did to try and wear down and confuse the young Jedi. Still cowering behind his defensive stance, the young Jedi moved his feet carefully, guided by the Force. He didn't need to look to avoid coming too close to the walls on either side of him. A few meters behind him there was a staircase, leading down to the ship's crew quarters. Deciding to change up his strategy once again, Maul started to focus his attacks at the Jedi's limbs, aiming for his wrists or ankles, and constantly pressuring forwards. Slowly, the Padawan was forced back, sweat dripping from his forehead and his face set in grim concentration. Maul pressed him until they were at the staircase, where Maul made one last force push with the dark side to get the young Jedi to fall onto the stairs. Instead the Padawan called up the force of his own, dispersing the worst of Maul's push, and gently touching his foot on the top step, not quite tipping over. He wasn't bad for a learner, or a Jedi learner at least. Maul almost felt some glimmering of bemused respect for the lad when he felt something wet running down the back of his leg. At first he was ready to dismiss it as sweat, but then he was hit by the smell of blood and rank pus. Holding onto the dark side as he was, and being a Zabrak that was resistant to pain, Maul hadn't realized his back was in agony. Everything from his shoulders to his legs felt as though it was on fire. His lungs were burning with the exertion, sweat was pouring off of him. If the Jedi Master showed up while he was in this condition, Maul may just be in a lot of trouble. Swallowing, and feeling a hint of fear mixing in with his anger and hatred, Maul rushed forward with a snarl. Neither he nor the Padawan put a foot wrong as they battled down the narrow staircase. Now using his full range of moves, Maul felt the tip of his lightsaber nicking the walls and sending sprays of melted metal around as she swung, lunged, and hacked at the Jedi, whose face began to change from grim determination to one of confidence and focus. They were almost at the bottom of the stairs, when suddenly the Padawan changed from his defensive Sorisa stance to an aggressive Adara form. Maul almost tripped and fell backwards as suddenly he was the one blocking each attack. The young Jedi rushed him with a range of blows, getting faster and faster, Maul finding himself pressed to keep up with him. Then the Padawan fainted and Maul had to leap backwards up the stairs to avoid losing his head when he nearly fell for it. At the top of the steps now, Maul felt his vision dimming, and shook his head to fight off unconsciousness. Maul could barely breathe, the air whistling through lungs clogged with mucus. He fought the urge to cough, because to tip his head before his attacker would be lethal. The Padawan didn't make the mistake of giving Maul a chance to recover. Seething with a sudden rush of helpless rage, Maul found himself slipping into a Sorisa stance, struggling to defend himself as his arms shook, and his knees almost felt like they couldn't carry him at all. The Padawan struck out at Maul's ankle, and Maul dipped his lightsaber low to block it, only to realize it was a feint too late as he felt a burning at his wrist. Maul's lightsaber dropped to the floor, his knuckles still clinging to the handle. "Get back!" Maul shouted desperately, his sick voice cracking on the high, desperate note. Fully embracing his fear, Maul put everything he had into shoving the warrior back. The Jedi leaned into the move, carving a funnel into the pressure Maul was exerting with his own powers, and instead of being flung away was only pushed backwards a few meters. Chest heaving, Maul was in agony over his entire body. His head was spinning, his breath rattling in his lungs and turning into an uncontrollable cough. Thick phlegm filled his mouth as he fell to his knees, scrabbling forward on his still smoldering stump to snatch up his lightsaber and missing hand, only for both of them to be tugged away from him by a pull from the light side. "No!" Maul hissed, just as men with blasters came up the stairs behind the warrior who had defeated him. "No!" He howled, turning to run, just barely avoiding a shot that would have hit him dead center if he'd even been a moment slower, but instead connected with what was left of his injured arm. He was much lighter on his left side as he staggered back up the stairs to the bridge, using his good arm to fumble the holocom on his belt. "Pick me up!" He howled to the scimitar's computer, leaping through the hole he'd cut in the view screen. The Padawan chased him, coming out of a combat roll to swing his blade, its tip just barely kissing Maul's back with a hiss as he slid down the side of the Naboo cruiser. Maul leapt into the air, not knowing if the dark side would guide him as he felt the scimitar in the Force closing in. The fingers of his remaining hand just barely caught onto the open ramp of the passing ship, and Maul clung for dear life as it flew away over the sand sea of Tatooine. Clenching his eyes shut at the sands born on the howling winds, Maul pulled himself up with one last final burst of strength born of the dark side and fear. He barely managed to get his knee over the edge of the loading ramp and scrabbling desperately with his wrist and his good hand he somehow made it up. Chest heaving, Maul refused to let go of the dark side. The moment he did, unconsciousness would claim him. Still in agony, he fumbled at the communicator on his belt, and ordered the scimitar to send one short message to his master. Mission accomplished. Then without another thought, Maul passed out. The mission that Yoda had dispatched Master Kagan and Padawan Obi-Wan had not seemed remarkable at the time, though Yoda should have known better than to trust any mission that involved the two of them. Any mission that particular went on seemed bound to spiral out into something strange and dangerous. The pair was supposed to negotiate a settlement with the Trade Federation on behalf of the Senate, and had instead returned with a whole array of dire news, including confirmation that there were in fact Night Brothers from Dathomir being trained as Sith. One of them had even tried to assassinate the ruler of Naboo. Queen Amidala had survived, but only because the assassin had killed her body double instead of her. Padawan Obi-Wan had narrowly managed to defeat the Sith, and in his own words only because they were already injured. Yoda could feel the honesty in the brave Padawan's words, and was relieved to see such a promising young Jedi survive such a deadly encounter unscathed. If Yoda hadn't believed him already, Kenobi even managed to bring back irrefutable evidence of his battle, footage from the ship, the hand of the Sith, and a lightsaber with a cruelly bled, red kyber crystal. All of this on its own would have been dire news by itself, but then Kagan took what was already a bizarre day and added to this tangled mess a new level that stretched it to near madness. If we hit 500 power stones in 24H, there will be an extra chapter. He is the chosen one. Kagan insisted, referring to a child that he'd brought with him from Tatooine. The arrival of the prophesied chosen one was the last thing Yoda, or any of the Jedi Council really wanted to deal with. They were trying to preserve peace, not ready themselves for a final war against a resurgent Sith Empire. Chapter 58, Phantom Menace 3. Here is your extra chapter, you guys deserve it, winky face. If we hit 200 power stones in 24H I will release an extra chapter. The arrival of the prophesied chosen one was the last thing Yoda, or any of the Jedi Council really wanted to deal with. They were trying to preserve peace, not ready themselves for a final war against a resurgent Sith Empire. After the two had delivered their report, silence filled the room, and Yoda felt all eyes turn to him, waiting for him to speak first. Well done, Padawan Kenobi. Yoda had said, after silence lingered too long. Go rest. Dismissed, you are. Thank you, Master. Obi-Wan bowed respectfully to the Master of the Order, before leaving the room. Only Kagan remained to address the council. At first Yoda was tempted to dismiss him, but could see there was more that needed to be discussed, and perhaps Kagan would have something useful to contribute. Mace Windu finally spoke. If this Zabrak was a night brother that would give weight to Sipho's theory, regarding Dathomir. Speculate, we will not, until the facts, we have. Yoda said firmly. He knew it was probably true, he hoped it wasn't, but he believed in the Force and not coincidences. And Anakin? Kagan asked. Test him, we will. Discuss this, we will. The Grandmaster promised. But wait for Night Voss, please. No one in the council had moved or said anything further until Quinlan arrived. He came into the chamber, dressed as disrespectfully as he usually was. Normally Yoda would have been bemused by his displays of defiance towards the council, but then he had been too focused on the matter at hand to even give it a second thought. Mace Windu leaned forward, offering the Sith saber staff to Voss. Wordlessly, Voss accepted the weapon, and held it away from himself for a moment. He glanced about the room at the other Jedi Masters, before closing his eyes. The moment that he opened them again. This is a Sith's weapon. Yoda nodded. What else do you see? Lowering his head again, Voss closed his eyes and focused. What he saw shocked him, but he remained upright. After a few more minutes he was finished, and opened his eyes. He turned a disbelieving gaze towards Kagan. That's a bloody good Padawan you've trained, Jean. How much did you see? Voss considered his words carefully. 5 Jedi have been killed by this lightsaber. I didn't recognize all of them, but I did see former Master Siolo Ur Manka, Master Anun Bandara, and Master Sipho Dyas. Yoda clenched his eyes shut, leaning back in his chair as his worst fears were confirmed. Voss went on to explain the extensive history of the weapon, from what he could see. The assassin had claimed the lives of multiple Force users outside the Jedi Order, half a dozen Black Sun Vigos, and countless others in between that Voss couldn't identify. And he didn't work alone. Voss finished with. This assassin was trained by someone else, someone much more powerful. He held the lightsaber only briefly, and all I could feel was bottomless hatred, for everything. Everyone, the galaxy, even. Of course. 2, there always were. Night Voss, go to the archives, and look into open cases. Find out who these other slain Jedi are. Without any defiance at all for once, Voss bowed and went to leave, then hesitated. He turned to address the chamber again. This assassin. Do we have a picture of him? Mace Windu raised his datapad, and sent the footage collected from the Naboo cruiser to Voss's holopad. After looking at it for a moment, Voss looked up at the Masters. This guy was a Dathomiri. Aware of this, the Council is. Yoda answered him. Discuss this later, we will. Once we have learned all we can. Voss nodded after a pause, then left the chambers. He didn't have to say it, the entire Council was thinking it, Yoda was sure. A powerful Night Brother trained as a Sith, sent to assassinate the Jedi Master who had long theorized the cult of Dathomir could be the recruiting base for a new generation of Sith. After that they sent Qui-Gon to wait outside while they tested the boy, Anakin Skywalker. Part of Yoda had hoped that the Qui-Gon had been mistaken, that this wasn't the Chosen One, and the Jedi Council would not have to seriously consider the possibility of another galactic war, but the child was as strong as promised. Just considering his connection to the Force, young Skywalker was simply the strongest Force user Yoda had ever seen in his 800 years. Before this moment, the only being Yoda had met who he could consider a match to his own power was young Tanya. She was also the subject of prophecy and yet to fully develop her connection to the Force, but young Anakin surpassed even her. The two of them both being alive at the same time left Yoda with a sense of dread that he would need to meditate away later. One child was destined to reveal the dark side, and the other would defeat it. In the meantime, Sipho's prophecy promised fire and hunger for the whole galaxy. A brief interview with the child showed that he was a less than ideal candidate for Jedi training. Strongly attached to his mother, proud of himself despite his nervousness, and still with a slave chip implanted in his neck. There was too much fear in him. Tatooine had left its scars on the poor boy, in his mind and on his body. Yoda felt a deep sympathy for the boy, but to train him as a Jedi would pose such an incredible risk. Bathed in the orange hues of Coruscant's setting sun, the Jedi Council sat in what felt like an eternal session. Yoda felt every second of his 800 years as they finally neared the end of what felt like the longest day in his entire tenure as Grandmaster. "Friends, your thoughts, please," Yoda asked the other counselors. "I think we should train him here," Yaddle added. "I understand that he's too old, but we can make an exception for the Chosen One, which it seems he is." There was a moment's silence, before Plo Koon spoke up. "The boy is already using the Force. If we send him back out into the world, he won't forget and grow out of his powers. He may be more likely to fall to the dark side." Even the most orthodox masters had to see his point, but that didn't mean they were ready to take him in as a Padawan. "I think you're forgetting something," Ki-Adi-Mundi pointed out. "If we don't train him here on Coruscant, then Master Jin is just going to take him to Indiner. This isn't a choice between him being trained or not, but whether we will be the ones who train him," Yariel Poof pointed out. "I think Dooku would greatly appreciate having Qui-Gon at the new temple. He's short of masters already." There were some nods of agreement, until Depa Billaba spoke up. "Dooku already has one prophesied child, do we really want to send him another?" Ki-Adi raised an eyebrow at her. "You don't trust Dooku. You voted to allow his new temple in the first place." "I did," Billaba agreed. "And I still trust Dooku, but he's not exactly acting as a subordinate to the Jedi Council, is he? He has own vision of how things should be done, and he hates the Senate. I'm worried about what kind of worldview he might imprint on young Skywalker." That drew more nods from the assembled masters. Finally May spoke up, addressing Yoda. "I believe the safest hands for the Chosen One are our own. Especially now that Voss has confirmed there is another Sith Lord out there, who is no doubt looking for an apprentice, and seizing any opportunity he can to kill Jedi." Yoda shut his eyes and leaned back in his chair, thinking for a moment. Training the boy was dangerous, very dangerous. But to let him go? Dooku might claim he wasn't recreating the Jedi Lords, but that was what it looked like he was doing for all the galaxy to see. The small handful of Outer Rim worlds that were enjoying the personal protection of a Jedi Knight assigned by Dooku were flourishing. With security came peace and prosperity, but also dependence. It was still very small, but Dooku was creating something that was coming to look like a kingdom of his own, with trade arrangements, a growing fleet, and a growing political presence. If young Skywalker went into Dooku's order, he would grow into a servant of that kingdom, and not to the people of the Republic to whom the Jedi were truly called to protect. Worse still, with a Sith being out there, even sending the boy away might be feeding him and his great potential to the dark side. "Very well." Yoda finally spoke up. "The Council is in agreement. Young Skywalker will be trained here, as a Jedi." Asleep in a dingy little room below ground, Aurra Singh was awoken by the sound of her holocom buzzing. Opening bleary eyes, she glanced over at where her device was plugged into the wall outlet, charging. She blinked once, twice before recognizing the caller. Sitting up, she quickly pulled a shirt over her head, and changed the device to only show her head and shoulders, before answering. You have a job for me. Yees. The creepy old man answered, his eyes covered by the hood of his hologram projector. One of my other agents has failed me, and is in need of repair. For now, you must go back to Naboo and finish what he started. A job on short notice like this is going to be expensive. Aura warned him. Who's the target? Queen Amidala of Naboo. Kill anyone who gets in your way. She will be protected by the Jedi. Gonna be even more expensive. Aura Singh grinned. But I know you're good for it. She's on her way to Naboo now. He warned. Succeed in this, or die trying, Singh. Chapter 59, Enmity I. 32 BBY. Seated at the desk in her bedroom, Tanya watched the news on her compad with some interest. Events were unfolding almost an entire galaxy away that had some bearing on her homeworld of Sereno. At this moment in time, the Trade Federation was attempting to annex the beautiful, forested world of Naboo, first with a naval blockade and now with an army marching through the streets of its capital. If the Galactic New Network was to be believed, an uprising had occurred. Currently the Queen and her palace militia were holding Newt Gunray, the Viceroy of the Trade Federation, hostage, and had forced him to sign a treaty promising to leave Naboo right away. There had been a diversionary fighter attack from their local patrol force, and even the indigenous Gungan tribes had coordinated with her forces to do battle with the occupying droid army, with predictable results. A small squadron of fighters without the ability to refuel and rearm was no match for a fleet of carrier ships, and that was to say nothing of the Gungans who didn't even fight with blasters, the poor fools. It was an awful plan, and Tanya was surprised to see even one part of it be successful with the Viceroy taken as a hostage. Unfortunately for the Queen, the Nemoidian was a depreciating asset. An unpopular, compromise leader chosen enthusiastically by the board of directors, Newt Gunray seemed to have failed his way upwards to the top of the Trade Federation. With a blaster pointed at his face, he had immediately caved to Queen Amidala's intimidation and signed whatever she demanded of him. The only problem was she couldn't exactly let him go while she was surrounded by a vast army of droids. The moment Newt left, there was nothing to stop him from tearing up their deal, turning around and taking her hostage instead. This stalemate had been ongoing for almost 48 hours now, with the Trade Federation forces gathering around the palace, ready to storm in at any moment. The newscast had a projection of the three-dimensional structure of Theed Palace with an army of tiny, ant-like droids forming in imposing, if impractical ranks on all sides, backed up by tanks and squadrons of circling vulture droids. Tanya suspected that from a negotiation standpoint, the Trade Federation still felt they held an incredibly strong hand. Newt Gunray was expendable, and any promises he made were under duress. Right now the Federation's board of directors were in an emergency meeting, and it would probably be hard to convince them that their huge investments in Naboo were worth abandoning for the sake of one easily replaced incompetent. The Trade Federation was bold and hubristic indeed if it thought it could snatch such a valuable gem from the Republic. With its wealthy, majority human population, Naboo was one of the galaxy's largest suppliers of plasma fuel for ships and speeders. Especially when compared to Sereno, Naboo was not a mere backwater supplier of raw materials for luxury goods, but a major source of a valuable and much-needed fuel for the entire Republic. To compare the two planets to nations back on Earth, Sereno was like Rwanda, resource-rich and slowly recovering from devastating internal conflict, while Naboo was akin to Saudi Arabia, supplying oil to the US and firmly under its protection. Tanya was certain at this very moment there were Jedi on their way to Naboo to shake some sense into the Trade Federation. If the scalpel failed, the Republic would soon reach for the hammer. No doubt it wouldn't be long until Naboo was free from Trade Federation, unless they could parlay some kind of arrangement with the Senate behind closed doors, which seemed unlikely now that the Senator of Naboo had been elected as Supreme Chancellor. Whatever gamble the Trade Federation had thought to make seemed to have failed. Well, good for Naboo, but bad for Sereno. Tanya suspected that if Sereno was annexed by the Trade Federation, there wouldn't be nearly as much of a fuss. Odoats, the corporation that Sereno exported all its lumber to, was already part of the Trade Federation. Sereno didn't even have direct representation in the Senate, being part of the Dastan sector. The senator from Axela voted on the sector's behalf. Ever since her first days learning to read in this galaxy, Tanya had been concerned about the Trade Federation and its relationship with her new homeworld. Originally, the Trade Federation was just a private security firm with the goal of securing trade routes for its clients from the pirates and raiders of the Outer Rim. Eventually, the TF secured the vast and lucrative contract to maintain order in the corporate sector, which had been established as a tax haven by the Republic for the sake of developing the Outer Rim as a whole. Over time they became the de facto government of the region as they managed defense and mediated internal disputes, and even received official recognition in the Galactic Senate as representatives of the sector. Historically, in this life and her previous ones, corporations did not make for very good governments. Even in the best-run corporation, a certain amount of inefficiency born from complacency and arrogance crept into the ranks of any monopoly over time, and a megacorporation that ran a world essentially gave itself control over everything. The Trade Federation had monopolistic power over the entire corporate sector, and had begun to spread its reach across more and more of the Outer Rim. At the moment, Sereno was only a client of the Federation, where Naboo had been a debtor. Still, the fact that the Federation was willing to forcefully invade and occupy a mid-rim world didn't bode well for an Outer Rim backwater. Well, that was being a bit harsh. Sereno was positioned directly over the Pearl Meon trade run, and quite resource-rich with a large population in its own right. All it really needed was better economic management, and Tanya was sure they could be a flourishing power of the Outer Rim in time. The problem with that was the Rim's other power, the Hutts. Tanya vaguely recalled reading somewhere in her previous lives that a feudal society bore a striking resemblance to an organized crime syndicate. The Hutts simply didn't bother with the distinction. In ancient history around the origins of the Republic, the Hutts were a fierce, long-lived warrior race that used their powerful bulk, shrewd intellect, and utter ruthlessness to conquer and subdue countless other species across a good chunk of the Outer Rim. Though the empire they formed eventually broke up into countless smaller kingdoms, the approximate borders of Hutt space hadn't changed for almost 25,000 years. Though they did a lot less fighting themselves these days, the Hutt upper class continued in the questionable traditions of their ancestors, using mercenaries and pirates to claw tribute from the poorly defended worlds of the remote Outer Rim. Essentially, a world like Sereno either paid the Trade Federation security fees, or it gave tribute to the Hutts. Between the two powers, the entire Outer Rim was trapped in a vice. Some of the wealthier worlds like Raxus were able to maintain their own security forces, but even they were feeling the squeeze. The constant threat and pressure of the Hutts was gradually pushing the Tyan cluster into the waiting arms of the Trade Federation. Tanya's eyebrows furrowed at that. Actually, that was strange, wasn't it? The Hutts were famously cunning diplomats, well known for their shrewd political acumen. If they were competing with the Trade Federation for control of the Outer Rim, wouldn't the optimal move be to reduce pressure on the Tyan cluster? The Hutts were incredibly long-lived, and so generally felt no desire to risk their necks in open war. They would typically acquire new worlds and clients by raiding their shipping lanes with untraceable mercenaries, and flooding their markets with spices. They would throw their credits around on the world's stock markets, trying to engineer a crash over time, along with other similarly underhanded tactics until their demands were met. Reading about the situation with Raxus on the Holonet, Tanya was genuinely surprised to see Hutt warlords gloating about the wealth they would claim on that world, while using only a small portion of their usual repertoire of economic warfare tactics. Even with this, the public of Raxus was outraged, pressuring their politicians to do something, anything. They cried, "Why not just cut a deal with the Trade Federation already and put an end to this madness?" Then Tanya noticed another oddity. Many of the pages she was reading shared the same talking points, despite none of them being associated with the Trade Federation. Every article that she found on the subject contained basically the same arguments, just framed from different sides of the issue. Raxus should just face reality, and rent a reasonable fleet from the Federation. The patriotic thing for Raxus to do was invest heavily in defense with Federation ships. Federation ships were more ethical than ones built and crewed locally, because they would only send droids and professional officers who knew the risks to their deaths in battle. It took pages of searching before Tanya finally found a single article encouraging Raxus to construct and manage its own defenses, and that was because another author referenced it derisively, and included a link to its page. When Tanya tried searching for the article herself, all that came up were criticisms of the article until she got to the third or fourth page. Feeling curious, she searched for news on her own homeworld, and found almost nothing. A few articles here and there mentioned the world's slow economic recovery, despite its natural resources, but really that was it. There were more than a few locally published outlets that made it to the main page, though. Still curious, and feeling like she might be pulling at the thread of something larger, Tanya tried researching other worlds that sat at the crossroads between Huda and the Trade Federation, starting with Felucia. It was almost the same story as with Raxus, many articles coming to the same conclusion from different angles. Trying to find an alternate view that offered a different solution took almost half an hour of scrolling through articles. Tanya checked in on a few more Outer Rim worlds that were considered disputed territory, and found basically the same story. She even found a few articles about the rise of piracy in Mandalorian space, extremely critical of the Duchess. It appeared that whatever force was at work coordinating the narrative against independent powers of the Outer Rim was just starting to spin into action against Mandalore. The thought gave her pause. Chapter 60, Enmity 2. It appeared that whatever force was at work coordinating the narrative against independent powers of the Outer Rim was just starting to spin into action against Mandalore. The thought gave her pause. Without even really having to convince herself, Tanya already knew that there was an invisible hand guiding the actions of the Republic's news outlets, the Trade Federation, and even the disparate feuding Hutt cartels. Being X. She growled his name like a curse. It was only a matter of time until he united the galaxy in a spiteful crusade against her, she knew. That was what he had done to Germania, just because he couldn't take even a hint of criticism. He promised she wouldn't be reincarnated again, and now he had proven himself a liar. With her brows furrowed in concentration, she opened up a new document on her compad and started documenting the connections she found. Behind her, the holoprojector showed the lights shutting down on Theed Palace as the Trade Federation cut the power to the upper levels. Absent-mindedly, she turned down the volume on the siege of Theed, focusing on the task at hand. Even in the height of Sereno's hot and soggy summer season, Dooku could almost feel the exhaustion beginning to melt away as he stepped off his light cruiser. With the sounds of chirping insects filling the air and bird song whistling through the garden, the sight of his wife coming to greet him brought a smile to his lips. She wasn't alone, either. Accompanying her, just old enough to begin crawling by himself, was Dooku's youngest child, Idion. As Dooku came closer, Idion held his arms out to his father, demanding attention, and was rewarded by being taken out of his mother's arms. Dooku leaned forward to give his wife a soft kiss, before holding his son up in the air as the boy wriggled in delight, smiling with just a few bottom teeth. He seems to be in a good mood. Right now he is. Athamine replied, and wagged her finger at the boy with exaggeration. You should have seen the tantrum he threw at dinner though. He still doesn't like anything but milk, yet. Dinner. Dooku glanced behind himself to see the sun only just starting to touch the distant horizon of treetops, and realized just how late it was. Ventress stepped out of the ship behind him, her travel bag slung over one shoulder. She seemed happy to be back as well. Good afternoon, my lady. She greeted Athamine with a friendly, informal bow that was barely a tilt of the head. Did you enjoy your trip? Athamine asked her. It was interesting, though we weren't there for fun. Asajj replied, hesitating slightly before asking her master, is it all right if I just head straight to bed? Anything you want me to handle first? Dooku considered for a moment, before shaking his head. Go. Asajj smiled, before turning away and heading for her room inside. Athamine watched her walk away, before turning to her husband again. How about you? Enjoyed your trip? Nothing but work. Dooku answered her, pulling his son a little closer so that he could rest Idion on his hip. But potentially productive. Dooku had traveled to Mon Calamari to follow up on some of the fallout from Sipho's unexpected death. He hadn't wanted to go in person, but constant connection issues with holocalls and inability to really get anything done without actually being there had forced his hand. In the end, he wasn't sure if he was any closer to convincing Counselor Akbar to sign on with the new temple, but just the fact they were willing to take an unscheduled meeting was a good sign by itself. Dooku had at least persuaded the Calamari to send a representative to inspect the new temple for themselves. Often diplomacy was about putting out feelers, rather than direct persuasion. Giving people a chance to sound a situation out for themselves could be more productive, when too much nagging came across as desperate. The last thing Dooku would want to do was make the Mon Calamari believe he needed them to join, because then they might start demanding special privileges, like knights that he couldn't spare for a world that wasn't even a member. Everyone wanted Jedi Knights, and he just didn't have the numbers. Dooku needed more Knights and Padawans, but especially he needed Masters. The first class of younglings were still 5 years from becoming Padawans, and the new temple's only senior Padawan was Ventress, who Dooku wasn't willing to promote just yet. The girl was talented and dedicated, she was getting closer to her knighthood, but Dooku was still reluctant to graduate her. Ventress would be his fourth Padawan, and Dooku would not cast her into the galaxy when he thought her ill-prepared. What happened to Komari had been unfortunate. Dooku did not wish that for Asajj. The two of them walked inside together, Dooku relaxing until he noticed the look his wife was giving him. She had something to say, so he turned to face her fully, still holding Idian. When is Tanya going to resume her lessons? Dooku paused at that. As soon as I can find her a master I trust. The look on Athamine's face made it clear she didn't accept that answer. It's already been a month since Sipho's funeral. If the new temple doesn't have enough masters as it is, where are you going to find one that you specifically trust with Tanya? Dooku fought back a grimace at that. It wasn't that he thought that masters from the Grand Temple wouldn't be unwilling or unable to teach Tanya, just that he didn't trust any of them not to influence her poorly. Of his two surviving former Padawans, Kagan was already training young Kenobi, and Rael of Eros was not really on speaking terms with Dooku. I was speaking to Kai, Athamine said, and Dooku just knew she'd been preparing for this moment. He says that the younglings in the class at the new temple are doing really well. Put her in with the other students. Dooku instinctively disliked the idea. Tanya was special, and far too advanced in her learning to fit in. Putting her in with them would make Tanya the target of resentment, and slow her growth. He would know. As a youngling, Dooku went through the exact same thing. Seeing the look on his face, Athamine held up a hand to forestall his objections. At the new temple, there's a green Jedi, from Corellia, I think. Apparently he was willing to put together an advanced course for another youngling. Kai told me he already had one student who was advancing too fast for the rest of the class, so it might be good for Tanya to be placed with someone who's more of a peer. A green Jedi. Dooku hadn't had too many dealings with them, but they weren't on good terms with the Grand Temple, not that it really mattered to him what those fools thought. I will interview this green Jedi. And I'll try to talk to Rael. If Rael isn't willing, and if the Corellian is up to the task, then that may be what we have to do. Even if he didn't like the green Jedi, Dooku might not have much of a choice. The new temple needed more masters very badly, it was a wonder that Narek was able to sleep at all. Thinking about the men made Dooku feel slightly guilty, because he still hadn't had the chance to help him tutor his lightsaber skills to the level of a master. I think you should talk to Tanya. Athamine pressed further. She doesn't listen to me the way she listens to you, and she's been spending all her time alone in her room since the funeral. If she liked to spend her time alone, why was that a problem? Dooku had been similar at her age. Well, he supposed he was always good friends with Sipho. Thinking about that made him grimace. I'll speak with her. He murmured. Tanya had been close with Sipho as well, but now he was gone, thanks to Sidious. Dooku frowned, and briefly touched the dark side of the Force. The call was gone, the whisper drawing him to Coruscant. Either Sidious had moved on to other things, or he would find another way to contact Dooku. Thinking about it made him, if not worried then maybe concerned. Dooku doubted a Sith would take to being ignored very well. There had been a small thought that was bothering Dooku for a while now, one that wouldn't quite go away. Sidious had felt that Sipho threatened his plans, and removed him. When Sidious discovered the prophecy about Tanya, wouldn't he eliminate her as well? The prophecy didn't specify Tanya, any of Dooku's children could be the one mentioned. A Sith wouldn't hesitate to remove any threat, or even a source of potential threats. In his mind, Dooku pictured Senator Palpatine visiting Sereno Palace, and his stomach turned. Just the idea of Athamine, or any of his children being in the same room as him made him feel furious. Did Dooku really need Palpatine? It was a dangerous thought, but one worth exploration. The clone army was already in production, and with Sipho gone the only contact the Kaminoans had with the Jedi was through him. It would be very easy for Dooku to simply inform them that the clones were for the new temple, not for Coruscant Jedi. In the end, they were running a business, and they would serve whoever paid them. Right now that was Dooku, even if he was getting the funds from somewhere else. Realistically, Dooku's plans were going well without much need of or help from Sidious anyway. Why go through all the trouble of creating an illegal clone army to pacify the Outer Rim, when Dooku was managing it fine without their help? He glanced down at his baby, Idian, who smiled up at his father and reached up to grip the bottom of Dooku's beard with a happy gurgle. Why work with the Sith at all, especially when the risks were so high? Chapter 61, Enmity 3. He glanced down at his baby, Idion, who smiled up at his father and reached up to grip the bottom of Dooku's beard with a happy gurgle. Why work with the Sith at all, especially when the risks were so high? After putting Idion down for his afternoon nap, Dooku turned and headed up the stairs to Tanya's room. He paused, knocking on the door and receiving no answer. When he stepped through inside, he found her room empty, but the galactic news feed playing over the stationary holocom in the background and the compad Tanya had left open on her desk. From where he was standing in the doorway, Dooku could see a text file open on the screen. Seeing that she wasn't around, Dooku felt curious about what his daughter was working on. It wasn't like the girl had a teacher at the moment, so any work she was doing was for her own benefit. He stepped into the room and picked up the pad, finding what looked to be a large report Tanya was working on. She was still concerned about the Trade Federation by the looks of things. Just then he heard the sound of a toilet flushing. A few moments later his daughter stepped out of her own sweet bathroom, and froze at the sight of her father. She looked between him and the compad, before suddenly she lost her mental shield and her feelings shone through the Force as embarrassed. "It's not finished yet," she insisted. "I see that," he replied, putting it back down. His daughter gazed at him, self-conscious. "I'm sure it must seem strange." Internally, he was amused at that, but kept it off his face. A child giving herself homework definitely was strange, but not something she would be in trouble for. She stilled herself after a moment, before realizing her mental walls were down and roughly jerking them back into place. Dooku watched as his daughter's posture straightened, and she stood with her back upright, and her hands behind her back like a soldier at ease. It was amusing, but also odd. Who taught her to stand like that? "Is this all you've been doing to keep yourself busy?" Dooku asked. "No, father," she answered. "I've continued to train every morning, with Asajj when she's available. I've been working on researching and writing up that report to present to you, and I've continued to manage the recruitment and training of the Royal Guard." The Royal Guard? Now that he thought about it, as Sipho's de facto Padawan, she would have assumed command of them until another was found. Dooku had been so busy with his work he'd completely forgotten about finding someone else to replace Sipho's work on Sereno's defenses. "How have you been managing the Royal Guard?" Dooku asked after a long pause. "I will arrange an inspection right away." Curious, but also aware that he was going off topic from his original purpose, Dooku held up a hand to forestall her. "We'll do it later. I came to speak with you about your continued instruction as a Jedi." Tanya's mental shield stayed firm, but Dooku thought he saw a hint of disappointment in her features. "Who will be my new teacher?" "I haven't decided yet, but you will return to the new temple soon." She nodded her head in acceptance, but Dooku could see that she wasn't happy with the idea. "Will that be a problem?" Dooku asked her. Tanya hesitated for just a moment, before answering. "I'm accomplishing a lot here. Spending so much time at the new temple will make it harder for me to train the Royal Guard, and manage Sereno's defense force. Those shouldn't be the duty of a 7-year-old child anyway, though Dooku knew his daughter was exceptional. Besides, she seemed to know what she was doing thanks to the Force guiding her and Sipho's tutelage. "You may have to appoint a subordinate to oversee things in your absence. Your Auntie Genza is my regent here on Sereno, and your mother oversees the palace in my absence." His daughter nodded at that. "Yes, father." Her tone of voice made it clear she was reluctant to put away her toys. She was being obedient, but Dooku remembered the advice he received from Narek back when he first met Tanya, about being a better father. After a moment, Dooku somewhat awkwardly sat down on the end of Tanya's bed, and gestured for her to sit in her chair. "Tanya, you must complete your Jedi training, before anything else. It's more important to me that you have mastered the Force and can protect yourself, than that you've begun to dabble in Sereno's governance." He frowned slightly. "There are extremely dangerous beings in this galaxy, who would desire to use you. I won't always be here to protect you. Until you master the Force, and master yourself, you will always be vulnerable." "Yes, father." Despite her audible agreement, Dooku still got the impression she didn't quite agree or understand. He wasn't sure how he could change her mind. At the very least, she would know why he did as he did one day. That thought took him by surprise, but then he supposed it was true. One day Tanya was going to have to know about the clone army, and Sidious. She would learn that it was her father who arranged for the death of her close mentor. Somehow he was worried just thinking about it. Not even Athamine knew the depths of his entanglement. And there was no way Palpatine could let Tanya live, not without using her. If Dooku didn't destroy Sidious, one day Tanya would have to. Dooku blinked, shocked by the certainty of that realization. He considered it for a few moments, before giving into it. There was no way around that fact that serving Sidious would mean destroying his family. They would either serve him or be killed. Sidious wasn't his friend. Or even an ally. Even disregarding the fact that Dooku was a Jedi, or that he wasn't so sure anymore that Sidious also dreamed of a galaxy at peace, or even that the man was a monster, the Sith was Dooku's enemy. A nervous pit opened in his stomach as he realized the enormity of what he was facing. "Father, what did you think?" Dooku stopped, looking up at his daughter. "Think of the report I was working on." She hesitated. "It didn't seem too paranoid to you, did it?" "I didn't get the chance to read it, daughter." He smiled at her softly. "You may be able to read several thousand words in the time it takes you to use the private, but your father is slower than that." She stared at him for a moment, like she didn't understand he was making a small jest. "I'm sure the report will be fine," he assured her. "What's it about?" Tanya looked like she wasn't prepared for his genuine interest. "It's nothing." Nothing, and yet she'd written dozens of pages about it. "Tanya, tell me," he said, more firmly. She looked at him for a long moment, before finally admitting, almost as if she was ashamed, the Trade Federation and the Hutts aren't competing with each other. In fact, I think they're working together, along with a powerful faction within the Senate. Go on. Imagine a being that's able to reach across vast distances without being traced, and coordinate events between sentients and organizations that would otherwise be incentivized against working together. Tanya hesitated, glancing at Dooku's face before continuing. "The Trade Federation is behaving incredibly strangely, and to a lesser degree, so are the Hutts. The two of them are carving apart the Outer Rim, while never stepping on each other's toes, and the Senate, acting in the name of fighting them, only ever seems to be helping them. To explain their behavior, I've supposed the existence of a sentience that I call Being X. Once I did that, all kinds of things began to fit together." "Like what?" "Like the Trade Federation's invasion of Naboo." Tanya reached over and picked up her remote. With it she turned up the volume on her holocom, displaying footage of a droid army surrounding an unfamiliar palace. "The Republic doesn't currently have a standing fleet, but they're fully capable of requisitioning the defense fleet's ships from Quadi or Corellia. Yet for some reason they've done nothing, and the Trade Federation was stupid enough to try this, like they knew the Republic would do nothing. At the same time the Federation's viceroy is being held hostage, and their board of directors has been in an emergency meeting as they struggle to agree on an interim leader. The Hutts have done absolutely nothing to capitalize on the chaos. It's like there's a larger force behind the Republic, and the Federation that they're even more afraid of." "How long has this been happening?" "This is the 15th day of the siege." "No, how long do you think these groups have been coordinating together?" Tanya turned back towards him, looking surprised. "You believe me?" "About Being X?" One name was as fine as any other for a creature of the shadows like Palpatine. "I do." A brilliant smile split Tanya's face, and waves of relief rolled off her in the Force as her mental control failed. For a moment, Dooku thought he saw tears of happiness in the corner of her eyes. "I'm sorry, Father." She blinked a few times, before reasserting control of herself and the mental shields came back up. "I never thought anyone would believe me about Being X." Guided by his own instincts, Dooku reached out and wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. She stiffened at the contact until he let go, looking up at him with shocked, round eyes. "I believe you, Tanya. But you must not tell anyone else." "Yes, Father. In fact, you must not keep a record of this that can be accessed through the holonet. Take your holopad and destroy it, burn the pieces in a furnace so no data can be recovered. Continue your research, but it must be kept on flimsy, which I will store in my vault. We'll get an old typing printer in the city for you to continue your work." Tanya grinned eagerly. "Yes, Father. Absolute secrecy. No one can know about this. Not your mother, not your brothers." Dooku thought for a moment. "You'll have to keep attending the academy at the new temple, pretend nothing is wrong, but use the holocoms there for your research, and then write up your reports here." Another idea hit Dooku. If any of the other Jedi ask about your research, we can say you're writing the next volume in Sipho's history series. Yes. An excited gleam was in her eyes. Tear the veil, indeed, Dooku thought, staring down at his child. Equal parts pride and fear warred within him. Incredible, the brilliant mind his daughter had and the gifts the Force had given her, to already have determined Sidious's existence even if she hadn't identified who he was yet. It was also dangerous, incredibly dangerous. If Dooku hadn't glanced at her report by coincidence. If she'd completed it, then shown it to someone other than him. The results could have been too terrible to consider. A cold shiver ran down Dooku's spine as he considered those sick, yellow eyes gleaming at him. That they would ever be directed at his daughter, at his children, made his stomach turn with worry. What had he been thinking, allying with that creature? Sidious was not, and had never been his friend. The moment Sipho made his prophecy about Tanya, Dooku had become destined to be the Sith's enemy. Now the only question was whether Dooku should aim to kill the Sith right away, or play along with him for a time and wait for a better opportunity. "Oh, look at that," Tanya said, watching the holo terminal. "The siege is breaking." Dooku glanced over to see the droid army begin to advance on the palace. Large hover tanks opened fire with massive blasters, sending pieces of stone and dust scattering in all directions, as gaping holes were blown in the palace walls. It seemed whoever was commanding that army couldn't care less if the viceroy survived or not. "I guess the scalpel has failed," Tanya murmured. Chapter 62, Nemesis I. 31 BBY. Count Dooku began the Galactic New Year with an inspection. His daughter proudly showed off his own house guards to him, and Dooku could clearly see their competence. He'd fought in many battles before, and had seen what the best warriors in the galaxy, the legendary Mandalorians, were capable of firsthand. Though his house guards didn't quite meet that lofty bar, Dooku couldn't think of any other military force he'd seen that was as fit, enthusiastic, and cynically disciplined. Apparently, while Dooku had been distracted with other things, Tanya had been taking her personal army on frequent, long-ranging hikes through the jungle where she enjoyed occasionally calling down artillery strikes on them with a battery of turbo blasters borrowed from Sereno's defense force. A strange mix of feelings overcame Dooku at the revelation, a mixture of pride at his daughter's talent and discipline, and fear over what Athamine would do if she found out. "There's just one thing, though," Tanya was explaining to him afterwards. "They're armed with blasters and armored in plastoids, which is standard across the galaxy for good reason, but they won't really have much of an edge in a fight without more specialized equipment. They're good, but still not enough. Did you have something in mind?" "I did have a couple of ideas, but they would all be very expensive," Tanya said. "A mixture of directed energy shields that resist blaster fire and subsonic slug throwers that bypass the shield would be quite effective." Slug throwers. He was uncertain about the idea of using such primitive firearms, but she seemed sure of the statement. "That seems unfeasible with our current means." For the price of 10,000 directed energy shields, Dooku could almost buy a warship. Tanya nodded in agreement, though looked disappointed. "The other idea I had was to create armor from blaster-resistant metals." Dooku almost scoffed in disbelief. He didn't think there were any large Cordosis seams being mined in the galaxy, not since the last of what was known and easily accessible had been mined up and used in the new Sith Wars. Everything that was left was privately owned, collected from scrap and broken down ancient artifacts. Expensive beyond belief. If the energy shields were unfeasible, then Cordosis was a fantasy, let alone Beskar. Trying to wrestle even a single ton of Beskar from the Mandalorians would probably result in generations of war. "I know, but I was thinking we could probably use Sicanium," Tanya continued, and brought up a recording on her holopad of a blaster test performed on different forms of durasteel. Zergium durasteel is the most common kind of durasteel, but it's only able to stop blaster rounds when thickly plated and shaped correctly, like a starship hull. Frick durasteel can temporarily block a lightsaber, and stop blaster rounds at low velocities. Sicanium durasteel is rare, but reportedly even hardier than Frick. I wasn't able to find any published blaster testing for them, but I can't see why a thick plate of it shouldn't at least be somewhat blaster resistant. She looked up at her father. "I know you're reluctant to bring the Galactic Mining Guild to Sereno, but we could at least hire a small, private mining outfit to start unearthing the stuff. We can start testing ourselves to see what we can do with it." Dooku considered her suggestion. As long as they weren't trying to sell the Sicanium on the galactic market, they shouldn't attract much notice. We'll speak with your Auntie Genza about it, and see what can be done, he promised Tanya. A few days later, Dooku and his daughter took a speeder to the advisory. It was a short journey through the city, but to his eyes it looked like it was doing better. Some of the wealthier people were driving around in shiny new speeder models, and he could see many of the older buildings were having work done on them to install new electrical systems or repair damaged roofs. It was good to see, though Dooku supposed the district that separates the palace from the center of government was likely to be the wealthiest on the planet. If Sereno did have a prosperous middle class, they could be assumed to reside here. As Dooku entered the advisory, the bureaucrats hushed up and avoided eye contact. They cleared a path for him, and bowed as he passed. He didn't think much of it, such respect was owed to the House of Sereno, and he naturally disliked their kind anyway. Genza was never trained as a Jedi, and had no ability to shield her mind at all. He felt her reluctance when he presented Tanya's proposal, along with her nervousness about telling him no. You have objections? He finally asked. Genza hesitated for a moment more before explaining. The security arrangements we already have with the Trade Federation have been more than adequate. If our security needs are already being met, then I think there are more important things for our government to focus on. Our planet's life expectancy is below 50 for adult men, and we're in the Republic's top 100 worlds for amputees as a percentage of the population. She shook her head. Look, digging into our Sicanium seams is a nice idea in theory, but we're already struggling heavily with our energy sector as it is. We're facing power shortages. Dooku asked, surprised. Genza nodded. Not shortages exactly, it's just a terribly underdeveloped sector. Our planet doesn't produce enough energy to meet our population's needs. Most villages are dependent on expensive solar power panels for any electricity that they have, which is dangerous because of power surges, and unreliable because of the weather. Even in regions like the open savannas where rain is rare, days are still shorter in winter and longer in summer, resulting in power floods and power droughts. How are we powering our cities? Dooku almost felt embarrassed to ask the question. He'd been so focused on his diplomatic efforts that he had to admit he hadn't been keeping up with the day-to-day affairs of his homeworld, let alone something as seemingly insignificant as why the lights still worked. Reactors run on imported plasma, but we're purchasing it at a rate set by the Senate. Unfortunately, at the moment, we just don't have the infrastructure to get power out to the towns and villages, and until we do it's just not cost-efficient to expand our power supply. Without more power we can't afford to build up our heavy industries, like mining. Tanya spoke up for the first time in that conversation. We have plenty of natural gas, as well as oil and coal. Why can't we just make old-fashioned coal fire and oil fire power plants? Because that would be illegal. Genza replied. It would violate Republic regulations on environmental protection. Tanya scoffed. The damage we do to the environment with our logging industry already must vastly exceed the potential effects of a little global warming. You may be correct, but we have to follow the rules as written. Some planets can find their way around it thanks to their friends in the Senate, but our world is just not an immediate concern to them. Which was a nice way to say that because Dooku was not taking part in the corruption and favor exchanging ways of the lobbyists and the slugs in the Senate, his people were suffering. Without an expanded energy sector, they couldn't build up their industries. Without that, they couldn't mine up their own Sicanium and turn it into usable goods. I'll start doing some reading. Tanya promised Dooku as they left the advisory together. If the Megacorps are leaving loopholes in legislation to allow themselves to skirt around the regulations, there may be some we can slip through as well. Coal-fired power plants would absolutely meet our needs. Don't stay up reading too late. Dooku warned her. You'll be starting classes at the new temple soon, once I've arranged a teacher for you. Irritation was clear on her face. Tanya clearly thought what she was doing was more important than mere lessons, and it was, but she wasn't the only one who could be reading old Senate bills. Whatever Tanya's strange gift at navigating paperwork and bureaucracy, she was still a powerful Force user and had to master it fully, lest it master her. Have M8 assist you, but you can't neglect your other duties. Dooku said firmly, then added. I'll call our lawyers and see if they find something as well. Chapter 63, Nemesis 2. The next day, Dooku set out for the new temple. His daughter remained in her room at the palace, reading through volumes of legislation on her new datapad and making notes as she did. It was impressive to see her focused so heavily on a task, especially at such a young age. Thinking about it, Dooku thought he had been similar when it came to mastering the lightsaber. When he arrived at Inn Diner, Dooku immediately went to the head office to speak to Narek about the specialized classes for Tanya. Before he could, the men met Dooku at the loading ramp to speak with him about another matter. When do you think Asajj will be ready to become a knight? Narek's question gave Dooku pause. Her skills were suitable for the role, and she'd learnt enough about how to conduct herself as a Jedi to properly represent the new temple without embarrassment. If anything, Dooku supposed she was practically ready now. The only reason he hesitated was because as the first knight to graduate from the new temple, he wanted her to be faultless to all criticism. But that was impossible. The orthodox Jedi of the Grand Temple could never accept her, and would always criticize or downplay her achievements. Even knowing that, Dooku was still worried. Of his 3 previous Padawans, Komari Voza had fallen to the dark side and died shamefully, having to be put down like a rabid dog, and Rael Averross disliked Dooku immensely, all but calling him a fallen Jedi the last time they spoke. Only Jin stood upright as a proud member of the Order, though his reputation as a maverick was almost as great as Dooku's own. Dooku worried what it meant for Asajj that he had such mixed success in his prior Padawans. Let me consider it some. I'll have an answer for you today. Narek nodded in acceptance. We need more knights. Not to say you should rush her through her training, but I just don't want to see her being held back. I understand. Dooku reassured him. Now, I'm here to talk to this green Jedi. Stern. Narek said, he's been wanting to talk to you for a while now as well. Was that the Corellian's name? When they met in his office, Dooku thought it matched the men quite poorly. He was on the shorter side of average with a receding hairline and worry lines wrinkling his brow. Like many Jedi masters he moved with a serene grace, though his soulful brown eyes seemed to hold a lingering sadness. Even in his resplendent green and gold formal robes, he seemed like less of a stern and more of a brittle. It's good to finally meet, Master Dooku. He spoke softly, and indicated a chair. May I take a seat? Wordlessly, Dooku indicated that he should. Watching the men gently lower himself into the chair, Dooku found himself feeling more and more unimpressed. A feeling that was cemented as Stern took out a tobacco cigar. May I? He asked. Dooku's nose wrinkled slightly, but he nodded. Good habits made good Jedi in his view, but then he supposed Rael Averross was also a smoker and a drinker, and he was a fine Jedi. Stern lit his cigar and took a puff, easing back into his chair. He obviously believed this was going to be a long conversation, so Dooku took out 3 fine glasses, and opened the fridge under his desk to take out the sealed bottle of wine he kept there for diplomatic meetings. Oh, yes please. Stern smiled, but Narek held up his hand. I have to get back to the faculty office. I've too much work to do. Dooku put 1 glass away as Narek left, and kept Stern in the corner of his eye as he watched the Corellian take a sip of wine with open relish. At least he had good taste. It was a very fine bottle, aged to perfection from the most renowned vineyards on Sereno, with that less sugary, richer, more bitter flavor that Dooku had personally grown to appreciate. They sat in silence for a moment, Dooku tasting his own wine and fixing his gaze on the other men who merely smiled. This is very good. Stern said. I'll have to get a copy of the label so I can buy some for myself. You can afford it. Stern laughed softly, and shook his head. Probably not. You're a very wealthy man, Count. Does your family enjoy such luxury? My students chatter that your son lives in a palace. Dooku's nose twitched in annoyance like that. Of course Kent would be isolated for being well off. Children are like that, even among Jedi. Oh, no. Kent is very popular. Stern smiled, fondly. He's always in the thick of things, playing with the other boys. He has your confidence, but not your, He glanced at Dooku's face, then continued. Well, he's just not as impressive as you are. You may want to consider arranging a play date for him. I'm sure you can accommodate the other younglings in his creche at your palace. From their conversation naturally flowed to Kentha's classes, and what Stern and the other masters were teaching him. By all accounts, Dooku's son was an energetic, perhaps too boisterous young boy who fearlessly approached any task, and quickly became bored with any amount of book learning or sitting around. These traits matched with what Dooku had heard of from his wife, but hadn't had a chance to experience much of himself, a thought that left him strangely wistful. When had he last made time for any of his children? I think he's a lot like you, Stern said. Or at least I get that impression from this short meeting. I happen to be rather good at reading people. Yes, but any Force-sensitive could claim the same. What are your plans for Tanya? Dooku asked. It turned out he had quite a few. Corellian Jedi had their own ways of training younglings, though the aims of the lesson seemed much the same from what Dooku remembered on Coruscant. As they chatted, Dooku found himself getting drawn into the subject more and more, offering suggestions to the men from his own time as a youngling. They talked for hours, and as they did, Dooku found himself getting more comfortable with him being his daughter's teacher. He seemed normal, if not particularly brilliant, and friendly without being overly familiar. Actually, that was something I've wanted to ask you about. Stern continued. My other student who I wanted to put into the advanced class with Tanya Dash. The Mandalorian child? Yes, little Vaya. He shook his head sadly. Poor girl. But Vaya wanted me to ask you about the new temple's views on marriage. Dooku paused at that. He could hardly forbid it when he was in wedlock himself, now could he? Though he was concerned about permitting relationships between Jedi. The last thing he wanted was for it to interfere with their duties. He certainly couldn't imagine calmly sending his own wife to conduct the dangerous duties of a Jedi. I would allow it, as long as it's not between two Jedi. Stern smirked, looking down into his wine glass. Something amusing. Ah, nothing, just. Making a relationship like that forbidden will only make it more appealing to some. Dooku watched the wistful look Stern was giving his own reflection, seeming lost for a moment. Do you have experience in such matters? I'm a widower, he said at last, looking up at Dooku. The life of a Jedi is a very dangerous one. I'm sorry for your loss. He nodded in thanks. It was my son who recommended I look into your temple, actually. They talked for a little while longer, before Stern finished one last glass of wine and left to go get ready for his afternoon classes. Dooku considered the men after he was gone, and found himself vaguely liking him. It seemed a cruel fate to lose a beloved partner, but when he thought about it, Dooku realized that was most likely his own wife's destiny. Athamine might well outlive him by half a century. Perhaps she would be happy to escape her ancient husband who neglected his children. With a sigh, Dooku resealed the wine and put it away, before taking out his holocom. With a few flicks of his fingers he pulled up an old contact and dialed it. It rang for a long time, Dooku slowly losing his patience as it did. After a minute had passed he hung up and put the device away. Don't. Chapter 64, Nemesis 3. With a sigh, Dooku resealed the wine and put it away, before taking out his holocom. With a few flicks of his fingers he pulled up an old contact and dialed it. It rang for a long time, Dooku slowly losing his patience as it did. After a minute had passed he hung up and put the device away. It seemed that Rael still wasn't prepared to talk to Dooku again. If only Kagan didn't already have a Padawan, then perhaps he could be persuaded. Though from what Dooku had heard, Jin had only taken on Kenobi with incredible reluctance. Why were there so few Jedi that Dooku could really trust? If only Asajj was a few years older. Maybe a few years being trained by Stern wouldn't be so bad, and when Asajj had passed her own night trials she could take Tanya to be her Padawan. The council on Coruscant would complain, no doubt they would want one of their own to be her teacher, but they wouldn't be able to do anything about it. Not if Dooku was still technically honoring their agreement. Was Asajj ready to become a knight already? Her skills were more than sufficient, and she had developed much composure under Dooku's tutelage. It was just so hard to know how she would fare under the pressures of real life. Her diplomatic work with Dooku hadn't given her much chance to face real danger out in the field, and there was no telling how she would handle it until she did. That was it then, really. Dooku would give Asajj a chance to demonstrate her competence in the field, and that would decide if she was ready for knighthood. His holocom beeped, and Dooku was surprised at the number. Rael. I wasn't expecting to hear from you. He answered it, smiling. It wasn't visible through the blue projection of the hologram, but Rael was dark-skinned and dark-haired, with brown eyes. Normally he projected a more carefree persona, but now Rael did not smile, his eyes narrowed slightly in distaste. I wasn't going to, but then I considered what's been happening and decided I owed you that much. Recent events. Dooku's mind raced, trying to pick up on what he could be referring to, but the only thing he could think of was Sipho's death a little over 2 months ago. You were invited to the funeral, but didn't attend. Rael raised an eyebrow. No, haven't you heard? About Naboo. The blockade. Dooku recalled. I've heard, but that's of no concern to me. No one told you. Rael shook his head. Kagan was on Naboo, Dooku. He was in the palace when the Federation began its bombardment. He's still missing. Dooku felt his stomach plummet. If Kagan was on Naboo, that meant Sidious would certainly kill him. Especially if he threatened his bid for the chancellorship. He was so shocked he almost didn't hear Rael speak again. I was sure someone would have told you. I only found out because I was talking with Dash. I'm sorry, Rael, I'll have to call you back. Dooku hung up. He dialed Yoda this time, and was answered quickly. Yoda opened his mouth, but Dooku interrupted him. Kagan is on Naboo. Why did you send him there? Why was I not told? Calm yourself, Master Dooku. Yoda held up a hand. A great Jedi, Kagan is. If I told you what dangers he faced, no time would there be for anything else. So often it is. Damn it, you old fool. Dooku snarled at him. Was Galadran not enough? How many more Jedi must you send to their deaths because you won't learn? Yoda stared at Dooku for a long moment. Tried have you, to keep a headstrong Jedi from rushing to battle? Oh, what a tripe. Dooku hung up without another word, and was in the process of dialing Sidious' number when he stopped himself. He couldn't call from here, not when the line would go through the new temple's network. Anyone with administrator access would see his call. Hastily, Dooku deleted the number, then left his office. He hurried through the halls, not paying heed to the knights who ducked out of his way, or the line of younglings pointing at him with excitement as he rushed past. He took the steps up to landing pad 2 at a time rather than wait for the elevator. Inside his ship he immediately made sure his onboard communicator wasn't connected to Indiner's network, before dialing Palpatine's number manually. Of course the slimy old man ignored his first call. Dooku had to dial 3 more times before Palpatine finally answered. He'd obviously been in the middle of something, because wind ruffled his hair and robes slightly, likely he'd stepped out onto a balcony before taking the call. This number is for emergencies, Dooku. He growled dangerously. This is an emergency, Palpatine. Dooku replied. Kagan is on Naboo. The Sith shook his head, sighing pityingly. Your former Padawan is of no concern to our plan, Count. If he stands in the way of the good of the galaxy, then there's no helping it. The chancellorship is practically already yours. Recall the Federation fleet. The election isn't until next month. I may be likely to win, but until the seat is in my hands the blockade will stay in place. Palpatine said, coolly. Damn it, Sidious Dash. Do not call me on my emergency line and do not use that name where it might be overheard, fool. Sidious hissed, teeth bared with rage. If you wanted to have control over events, you should have answered my call months ago when I was planning this. Instead you were busy sulking like a craven child over a man that you helped kill. Dooku hissed right back. Do not place the blame for that at my feet. That was your doing, not mine. Oh, please. Now you sound like the Jedi Council, passive, unmoving, desperate not to be blamed for your own inaction. You knew it had to happen and you approved of it. Just as you knew that any Jedi sent to intervene at Naboo would be in danger, too. Enough empty sniveling over weakling Jedi. He snarled. Dooku opened his mouth to reply, then closed it. He was right, damn him. A cold shiver ran down Dooku's spine, as in that moment he realized he was trapped, helpless. This was a situation of his own making, each of his actions mounting one after another to lead him to this point. He wanted to protect his dear student, just as he wanted to save his friend, but interfering here risked their plan. Everything he had built, and everything he was working towards would be undone if his connection to the Sith was ever revealed. Dooku hung his head, helpless and ashamed. Good. Palpatine droned out breathily. Remember, this line is for emergencies. Next time you want to discuss our plans, Dash. Next time. Dooku raised his head, feeling cold anger surge through him, an angry voice hissing in his ears. With sudden clarity, he remembered Tanya's discovery, and what it meant for her and his whole family. The dark side called to him, and fearlessly he seized it. Who will you demand I sacrifice next time, Sidious? My children. My wife. Of course not, friend. Of course not. Do not call me friend, Sith. Dooku spat. On your lips it means pawn. Tool. You would cast me aside in a heartbeat the second it suited you. Through the dark side, Dooku felt that thread linking him to Sidious tugging. This is just a misunderstanding, Dooku. Sidious murmured, softly. I can give you everything you ever wanted, no need for sacrifice. With the power I offer you can have friendship everlasting. Knowledge and power, everything you could ever want. Your loved ones need never die. Dooku found himself calming, his rage and fear giving way. Was Sidious really to blame for this? Wasn't Yoda the one who sent Kagan to his fate? Dooku needn't panic over a trifle, not when there was a much greater enemy to focus on. Yes, that's it. Sidious whispered. Just come to Coruscant, and we can discuss this there. We can redraw our plans if we must. There's no reason at all we can't have everything in dash. Drawing on all the dark side he could hold, Dooku focused every fiber of power he had into that thread. He poured every ounce of his hatred, every bitter thought that ever touched his heart, and every ounce of despair over the future of the galaxy into what seemed like a ball of foul fire. To that he added every loved one who had died for incompetence, and the regrets over Dooku's own actions influenced by this man. He laid it all at Sidious' feet, channeled from the darkest corner of Dooku's soul into that narrow thread, connecting him to Coruscant. As Dooku's feelings traveled back to the beating black heart of the corrupt republic, it burned away that connection with it, forging a new one in its place. Still connected to the dark side, all of his hatred, rage and fear were directed to a single narrow point. A message had been sent, and a name given. Nemesis. 100,000 light-years away. Darth Sidious received all of it, pausing mid-sentence. His holographic image stared up at Dooku's face, and he sneered. So be it. Then he hung up. Chapter 65, Nemesis 4. 100,000 light-years away, Darth Sidious received all of it, pausing mid-sentence. His holographic image stared up at Dooku's face, and he sneered. So be it. Then he hung up. Dooku collapsed back into his chair, energy spent. He released the burning cold of the dark side, feeling relief as it dissipated. Despite everything, he laughed. That's right. So be it. Dooku growled, before reaching for his holocom. He considered his options and what he was about to do, before deciding there was no real other choice. To save Kagan he needed a navy, and his first hammerhead wasn't going to come out of production for months. The Trade Federation was already a puppet of his mortal enemy, and so to rely on it for protection was beyond foolish. He may as well break the connection cleanly, on his own terms. With a feeling of reluctance, he called his own daughter's holocom. Yes, father. Tanya answered. Tanya, I need you to take the House Guard, and use it to commandeer a Trade Federation defense picket. Use any means or subterfuge necessary, but we need command of those ships. Tanya blinked, gaping. She sat up, having been laying in bed reading what was probably old Senate bills. Father, are you sure that's wise? Tanya, you must act now. I do not have time to explain. Dooku answered her. The Trade Federation are now our absolute enemies. Seize the ships, do it now. His 7-year-old daughter stared at him for a long moment, before her face hardened. Yes, father. I'll begin right away. Dooku nodded and ended the call. To send his daughter to do such a thing would normally be unthinkable, but she had direct command over the House Guard, and Dooku realized that she was the only one on Sereno he trusted to do such a thing. He stood up, and strode down the ramp of his ship and back to the new temple to marshal his resources. The Count of Sereno was going to war. With repeated motions, Asajj Ventress worked through her lightsaber forms alone. Usually only 2 or 3 hours were seen as enough for practice for most Jedi, but already she knew that wasn't enough for her. Her teacher was Dooku, and he had informed her that a professional athlete would usually train for 6 hours a day, even without stims to aid in cell regeneration, just a diet of protein and electrolytes. When he was a Padawan, he'd trained vigorously to master the lightsaber and earn his reputation as the galaxy's greatest duelist. So that's what Asajj did as well. Her dream wasn't only to be a Jedi Knight one day, or even just a Jedi Master. It had taken a while for her to realize, but Asajj slowly came to think that Dooku hadn't realized he was training her as his replacement. She was traveling with him constantly, shaking hands at all the same diplomatic parties that he did. The Duke of Raxus knew her personally, as did the Duchess of Mandalore, the Duke of Axela, several senators, a few CEOs of megacorps operating in the Outer Rim, and many, many more. Most politics was done via trust and personal relationships, and these contacts were an important tool for the Grand Master of the new temple to leverage. In addition to the personalized lightsaber training for Asajj, Dooku had been careful to teach her about how to stand, walk, talk and act around power. There was almost a ritual to how things were done when two sentients that could command planets met, maybe better described as a common culture. Not even that, it was a disposition. Power required an appearance, an external facade. True power didn't need to make threats, the threats were implicit. Asajj didn't know quite how to describe it, but she had seen it many times now. Perhaps the best way to think of it was certainty, or maybe confidence that towed the line to arrogance. All Asajj needed was a chance. She wanted to command, to lead others. Only a Padawan, yet, but when the time came, if she really was to replace Dooku as the Grand Master, she needed a flawless reputation as one who thrived under pressure and handled command well. Someone like Master Narek. She smiled at the thought, as her lightsabers flashed in front of her. Those were the two that had trained her, Dooku and Narek, and she felt that if she could combine their traits she would be almost perfect. Personable, tireless, and focused like Narek, with the ability to inspire trust in others, while being grand, commanding, and composed like Dooku. Of course she would keep an eye out for other great leaders she could learn from, but all of a sudden, every hair on the back of her neck rose up with a spine-tingling shiver. For a moment on in Diner, something rapidly burned through the Force, like a cold fire. For less than a second, Asajj felt a terrible fear that she couldn't describe as everything went dim. It wasn't her own fear, but someone else's honed to a razor edge. Then it disappeared like it had never been there. The heatless fire was gone, leaving Asajj chilled at the memory of it. The light side which had been glowing throughout the room as she practiced and drew more in towards her, now seemed dim and scattered. Quickly toweling the sweat off herself, Asajj stepped out of the new temple's practice hall to see she wasn't the only one that had been disturbed by what happened. Narek was out in the hall, looking just as surprised as Asajj felt. He hadn't drawn his lightsaber yet, but his hand was on the hilt. "Master, what was that?" Asajj asked. For a moment it was almost like something was burning away the Force itself. "That was the dark side, and a lot of it," Narek answered, frowning at her. "A very powerful dark side presence just moved through the Force here on Diner." That only left Asajj feeling more confused. "I thought only someone who had used the dark side could feel it. To a Jedi it just seems like a brief shadow in the Force." He nodded. "It's likely you touched the dark side when you were a newborn on Dathomir, before you were sold into slavery. When you were young you used the dark side a few times before I taught you otherwise." He considered what to do before frowning. "I need to go find Dooku, and see if he knows what's happening." Narek turned and walked down the hall, and Asajj frowned at his retreating back. A worm of worry worked its way into her gut as a thought occurred to her. Her former master hadn't explained why he knew what the dark side felt like. Chapter 66, Boarding Action I. 31 BBY. Each of the Federation's Munificent-class star frigates would have been described as 4/5 of a kilometer long in Japan, or half a mile in Germania. It had been years since Tanya had used either measurement system, but watching the approaching vessels from the window of her speeder almost left her feeling strangely overwhelmed. Even the largest battleship in Earth's history, the Yamato, was only 250 meters long. The scale of this galaxy was so different compared to anything on Earth, with wars waged across light years and some legendary battlefields choked with billions of dead. Seeing the sun shining down on the frigates, so vast that they cast shadows over the spaceport's terminal building, impressed upon Tanya the scale of what she was about to attempt. Shaking her head, she looked forward, noticing one of the house guard glancing back at her in the rearview mirror. The guard next to him in the passenger seat passed a small dark blob of some unknown substance behind his headrest to the man sitting next to Tanya. The driver, a slightly older soldier from Coruscant, didn't take any, but the newly trained guards from Sereno both broke off a piece each and were still chewing on them as they fixed their helmets in place. The driver, a Sergeant Sayo, noticed her watching the exchange, and explained, "It's not a food, it's a stainer, a local battle tradition. The colonel encourages them to keep such things if it helps morale." Tanya glanced over at the men in the passenger seat, who turned to face her. "Why the tradition?" she asked him in Outer Rim Basic. "Don't want alien to see smiling white teeth in shadows, Highness," he answered in heavily accented Standard. Of course, one of the main draws for people to join her house guard was the education that came with it. An opportunity to learn to read and write, as well as learn Galactic Standard, was sorely tempting for anyone out in the villages looking to raise their standing in life. Or so I told Old Way. For rating. "Are the other men doing the same?" Tanya asked. Still smiling, he nodded. "All Saren known is be a helmet in Way, but is Old Way. Not for Coruscanti, eh?" Tanya considered for a moment, before holding out her hand. He looked at her surprised, before offering her the stainer. Tanya broke off a small piece, then handed the rest back to the men. She wrapped up her portion in her handkerchief, before pocketing it. She didn't want to do anything that might alert the Trade Federation of her intentions. A princess with blackened teeth and gums would certainly look strange, but she would try some herself later. "I'm Saren known, too," she said to him, and looked forward. If participating in such a simple tradition helped inspire loyalty in her men, then it was worth it. He stared at her for a long moment, before looking back ahead. No doubt he was excited to see his first battle, even if hopefully no one would die today. Tanya's convoy of speeders finally pulled up outside the spaceport. A bodyguard from the vehicle behind her ran forward to hold the passenger door for her as she stepped out onto the tarmac, feeling the tiny spots of an early rain mixing into her upraised hair. Today she wore her hair high, stylized and formal, looking like Corps Ward nobility. Of course she had her cape and chain that marked her out as heir, but it was over the top of a flowing blue dress with silver droplets around her neck. "Master Jin has passed away, I take it?" Obi-Wan nodded. "We were forced to hide in the swamps when our attack failed. My master's wounds festered, and he passed away." "I see. Thank you, Padawan Kenobi." He paused for a moment, before informing him. "I'm sending you my Padawan's comm link. Please arrange with her to have yourself, and whoever else is with you, recovered." Then without another word, Dooku hung up. He sat there in the chair on his bridge, feeling as empty as he did after Galadran. Like his chest was just a hollow cavern filled with the stench of death and failure. Worse even. An assassin. Of course that Sith had sent an assassin. The compad in Dooku's lap crunched into a tiny shivering ball, glass shattering and dusting his lap as he clenched his fist so hard that his knuckles turned white, and his fingernails drew blood from his palm. Sidious. Liar. Traitor. The Senate. Supreme Chancellor of the Republic. I am your nemesis. Chapter 73, The Queen Humbled I. 32 BBY. True hunger was something Padme had never known before. She'd never been a glutton, and even missed a meal or two when focused on her work, but this was different. Very different. This wasn't her choosing not to eat for an afternoon or a day at the worst to stay in shape. This was the 7th day in a row without food of any kind at all. The Trade Federation blockade had stopped all shipments to Ore from Naboo a month ago when this whole nightmare had started. At the time, Queen Amidala's counselor for defense had warned her it would be only a week before food shortages would start, her world being an importer more than an exporter. How many days had it been since then? Padme dimly realized that not even an entire month had passed, though it almost felt like a lifetime ago now. When her militia and handmaids had managed to capture the palace's upper levels along with Newt Gunray the viceroy, Padme had hoped that would be the end of things. The Nemoidian was an absolute coward, and had conceded to all her demands, even desperately suggesting more concessions she could extract from the Trade Federation. For a few minutes, Padme had felt like everything was going perfectly to plan. Then the Gungans had been defeated. Padme's heart ached for them, really it did, but she had known they wouldn't win. They were too primitive, and too few in number. However brave, they were a distraction, a lesser piece on the Dejeric board, sacrificed when needed. Padme hated it, but she'd known it to be true when she joined in an alliance with them, so wasn't too surprised or disappointed when they were routed in battle. It was the defeat of Naboo Security Forces fighter fleet that had dashed her plans. Without a convincing naval defeat, the blockade of her world had continued, and the droid army still marched the streets of Theed. Newt Gunray would make any promise, but without any damage done to the Trade Federation's precious fleet, his words were worthless in the face of the board of directors' hunger for profits. The two Jedi, Padawan Kenobi and Master Jin, had been the first ones to realize how bad their situation was. Within the hour, they had quickly destroyed all the remaining droids in the palace, and sealed the entrances and exits. Then the siege had begun. They had plenty of power thanks to Theed Palace being built directly over the plasma refinery, and plenty of water in the tanks so they were able to drink and bathe as needed. The problem was the food. The kitchens and larders had been raided in Padme's absence from her homeworld. She didn't know for sure, but she guessed some of the palace servants had snuck back in once it became clear the blockade would last indefinitely, and grabbed everything they could. Or maybe some Nemoidian officer had sold it all to hungry citizens for easy money. The only food in the palace had been some refreshments forgotten in the fridge in the diplomatic lounge. Even rationing them out, her and her few loyal remaining servants were now starving. A few bottles of cider, some snack bars, and packets of dried fruits and nuts were not enough to keep 20 or so handmaids and palace security fed for a fortnight. Only the Jedi seemed to be fine. They'd eaten less than anyone else since their arrival, and had been the most active. "The Force sustains us," Master Jin explained, though Padawan Kenobi wasn't so good at concealing his feelings that Padme missed the slight look of disagreement he had in his eyes. As the days had passed, Padme had found her energy dwindling to almost nothing. Looking at the mirror, she wasn't surprised to see her face had become gaunt. The pain of her hunger had long since gone away, as the bacteria inside began to sate themselves with her stomach lining to survive. Her thoughts slowed down, her mind becoming slightly dull as she occasionally struggled to think through the fog that choked every thought. Words and plans that would usually leap to her immediately seemed to stumble about pointlessly instead. After 2 weeks, she even began to see her guards muttering to each other in the corners when they thought she wasn't around. She wasn't a lip reader, but she didn't need to be to see the word surrender spoken more than once. Newt Gunray was as starved as anyone else, and obviously had the same thoughts. "Please, I'm a businessman. I can negotiate for you, and make sure you're all well fed and taken care of." There was a wheedling desperation to his tone. He was no great mind, but even he could tell that he'd been hung out to dry by the rest of the Federation. His aide, Gil Ramos Libkuth, nodded along in breathless agreement. "There's no reason we can't all leave alive." Captain Panika scowled at them. "I can think of a few reasons why you shouldn't. Revenge will achieve nothing." Master Jin admonished him. "Might raise morale." Panika replied, but took his hand off the blaster strapped to his hip. An hour later, he approached Padme with his lips set into a reluctant grimace. "Queen Amidala, this plan has failed. We do need to consider surrender. Those two aren't worth much, but they could at least be worth enough to guarantee us decent treatment." Padme hesitated, feeling the temptation strongly. Surrender might even be worth it if it meant something to eat, before she resolved herself. "But if I surrender, then my people will truly be lost to these thugs. Better to live to fight another day, my lady. My people are better served by a martyr than a hostage." Panika grimaced, obviously upset at the idea but not able to disagree. Like he'd been summoned, and speaking as though he had been listening in on the entire prior conversation, Master Jin appeared. "If I may, Your Highness, Captain Panika speaks wisely. Though noble to die a martyr, what your people need most is for you to keep fighting for them. Obi-Wan and I have come up with a plan for you to escape." Both he and his Padawan seemed to move effortlessly and soundlessly, fading into the background at times even though they were the most dangerous men here by far. It was unsettling at times how these Jedi just seemed to appear, like spirits or ghosts from old spacers' tales. She considered his words for longer than she should have. "Why didn't you mention this sooner?" At the time, there was still a chance that the Trade Federation could be persuaded. Now, Obi-Wan and I can feel them readying for an attack. "Our time is up, Your Highness." Padme pursed her lips. She'd never quite come to trust the Jedi, but they had been powerful allies. Now she learned they had been concealing an escape route from her, and felt a flash of suspicion. What was the real reason for not telling her sooner? As if reading the very question from her mind, Kagan leaned closer and murmured low enough that only she could hear it, "We have a vessel parked in the city, a bongo, but it can only carry 3 people out. You, myself, and Kenobi. Everyone else will have to stay here, and surrender. Surrender to the mercy of the Trade Federation." Given the assassins they'd hired, the massacres they'd already perpetrated on the Gungans, and the blockade choking the life out of her citizens, Padme certainly didn't think they could be trusted with the lives of her few remaining guards and handmaidens. The expression on Panika's face showed he was thinking much the same thing. "Captain, I won't ask you to dash." She was cut off by the sound of an explosion. The walls of the palace shook, and dust rained down from the ceiling. The guards who had been sitting all rose to their feet, taking up their blasters. Outside, the sound of thousands of battle droids marching in unison penetrated even the thick bricks of the castle walls. The Federation was beginning its assault. Newt Gunray seemed to freeze, before he suddenly started speaking. "You've waited too long. Please, bring me a holocom. This is the last chance you have to dash." Panika shot him. It didn't register for a moment. Padme heard the noise, smelled the burning amphibian flesh, and saw the body fall, but couldn't believe the captain of her security forces, a friend and associate, would murder someone in cold blood. Panika's expression was hatred personified. His lip curled slightly up to expose a hint of his teeth, and his brows drawn down in a dark glower. The remaining Nemoidian, the Viceroy's toady, Gil Ramos, was frozen on the spot. He trembled helplessly, as the captain strode forward to press his blaster into one of his bulbous red eyes. "No surrender. For Naboo." Panika snarled, and fired. The rest of the guards and handmaidens looked at the smoldering, headless corpse propped up in its seat, and were too stunned to react for a moment until one voice took up the chant. "No surrender. For Naboo. For our queen." A woman's voice cried. "Everyone, defend the doors." Panika yelled. He looked to the queen, and Padme felt a chill run down her spine at the emptiness in his eyes. All hope gone, with only spite left to give him purpose. "Well. Go." He waved his hand at her. "We'll hold out as long as we can." Chapter 74, The Queen Humbled Too. "Everyone, defend the doors." Panika yelled. He looked to the queen, and Padme felt a chill run down her spine at the emptiness in his eyes. All hope gone, with only spite left to give him purpose. "Well. Go." He waved his hand at her. "We'll hold out as long as we can." His back turned away was the last Padme knew she would ever see of him, and she shivered. It was one thing to read about what war could do to good men, and another to see it for herself. Captain Panika, the cynical but practical man she knew, was gone, unneeded at this moment. In his place a more helpful monster now stood, ready to sell his life dearly. All she had wanted for her people was peace, and somehow she had led them all to this. "This isn't what she wanted. This isn't what I wanted," Padme said aloud. "It's okay, it's over now," Kenobi answered. "This wasn't meant to happen. You're safe now. Come on, get up." "No, everyone, please stop. Queen Amidala, wake up." Padme's eyes opened slowly, and she blinked in surprise as she stared up at the unfamiliar roof. Her mind returned to a time not even a year ago, before the assassins, before the weeks spent hiding in a swamp living off insects and reptiles with a sick and weakening Jedi Master, before the journey through the planet's core, or the siege, or Coruscant and her own senator's betrayal, even before the time on Tatooine or the blockade started. It seemed a lifetime ago, but it wasn't even half a year. She sat up, looking over at Minla, her only surviving handmaiden. She'd been captured alive by the Trade Federation in the final assault on the palace, and pressed for information. Her face was still marked by bruises, and she'd yet to find a suitable set of dentures to replace her newly missing teeth. Minla was once beautiful, now her body was a mesh of scars, and her missing fingernails were only just starting to grow back. Apparently the Trade Federation had brought in a consultant to talk with her, an infamous mercenary named Aura Singh, and the second assassin sent after Padme. Minla insisted she didn't tell them anything, but Padme didn't care if she did or not. She was only glad that her handmaiden was alive, and the monstrous torturer was dead, beheaded by Padawan Kenobi. "You were having a nightmare, Your Majesty." "Thank you, Minla." Her palace was in wreckage after being pounded by the Federation's artillery and stormed by droids. In the meantime, Padme was given the place of honor at the Royal Theat Hotel. It was a luxurious room, with silky white sheets and soft cushions. It was even air-conditioned, a relief in the hot Naboo summer. Breakfast was small, a pair of boiled eggs with salt and pepper, and a cup of herbal tea to wash it down. The meager fare almost made her miss the wild game Obi-Wan had hunted while they hid in the swamps. The city still had food shortages, though not as bad as they once were. Every day more and more merchant freighters arrived to charge exorbitant prices for meager provisions, hurrying to sell while demand was high. Padme had seen families bartering precious orodium rings and necklaces for a sack of unidentifiable tubers from who knows where. Still, food being sold at high prices was better than no food being sold at all. It wouldn't be until regular shipments resumed that food prices would stabilize, though in the meantime Count Dooku seems to have been generous enough to arrange for large shipments to start making their way here from Sereno. The first few cargo haulers were due to arrive today, after which the Count planned on leaving. Padme wasn't sure what to make of him. When he first arrived, she'd been relieved that the blockade was finally gone and this nightmare was at an end. Then the Count dispatched a small ship to collect her and Obi-Wan from the swamps they were hiding, and he didn't even speak to her. He had a private meeting with Obi-Wan to get the full story of what happened to Qui-Gon Jinn, then dropped them both off in Theed. Apparently, Qui-Gon was his former Padawan, and afterward Obi-Wan had told her the only reason at all he'd come to Naboo's rescue was he learned his old student was in harm's way. Padme was almost flabbergasted by that. In the end it wasn't the Republic, or the Jedi, or any of the institutions her people relied on to keep them safe which finally freed them, but Dooku's apparently very inappropriate attachment to Master Qui-Gon Jinn. Padme didn't even know what to think. Of course there was the fear that the men would turn out to be another conquering invader, but instead he just seemed to want to leave now that his mission had failed. Padme wasn't sure why he was in such a rush, but he had informed her they would be having a meeting before he left, and she was really in no position to refuse. To meet him formally, Padme and her handmaiden did their best to properly dress her up in her royal regalia. It was hard to do the work of half a dozen hands with only a single pair, but Minla persisted for hours. Padme's hair was straightened out, and curled up in elaborate rolls and buns, and her face was painted white with straight lines trailing from her eyes. Unfortunately, not much was available of her official royal regalia, no doubt plundered by a Neimoidian, and possibly lost to deep space when the fleet was destroyed. The owner of the hotel and his wife had been kind enough to provide Padme with an elegant set of purple formal robes, and tasteful orodium jewelry inset with real gems, rubies and amethysts. The hotel owner was even kind enough to clear the hotel's conference hall for her and the Count's meeting. It wasn't like he was having much business these days, but she appreciated the effort he and his bellboy went to, dragging into the room a massive, high-backed, decorative wooden chair carved with sea monsters for her to use as a throne. She had no idea where he got it, but Padme was so grateful she didn't mention the obvious fur-ox it left in the red carpets, giving away how hasty the preparations for the meeting really were. Then she waited, with Minla as the only surviving member of her retinue, face hidden by a veil and silken gloves to hide her hands. Such incredible loyalty, especially from Minla, but also from the hotel owner and his staff, left Padme feeling completely unworthy. The Count arrived, pushing apart the double doors with a wave of his hand. He strode into the conference room, cape billowing behind him and looking every bit like the Jedi Lord his detractors accused him of being. He was a member of the Outer Rim nobility, who openly wore a lightsaber and now commanded a fleet. Even his heir was being trained as a Jedi. Technically his titles of Jedi Master and Count were unrelated, but by every practical reality he was a living breathing Jedi Lord walking straight out of the pages of history. Count Dooku, we are grateful that our Liberator found time for us. Padme greeted him from her improvised throne, slipping in a slight sarcastic sting, though he hardly seemed to react. In fact, his gaze wasn't even on her, but seemed to be somewhere in the distance. Or perhaps you'll need to find another time for us. No offense was intended, Your Majesty. Dooku replied, his eyes finally resting on her. I just sensed someone approaching who I intended to avoid. Grand Master Yoda? Padme asked. At Dooku's surprised look she explained. Padawan Kenobi said he was coming. Why do you wish to avoid him? My intervention to save your planet was not legal by any standard, unless of course we have a pre-existing defense arrangement. Which we do not have. But which we can claim to have. The recent civil war left my world's record-keeping in an awful state, and I'm sure the destruction of the palace has done all kinds of damage to your own archives. Unfortunately, things being as they are, only copies of the original documents can be provided. You want us to lie for you, Count? I want you to help your liberator in the coming court battles he likely faces. Dooku smiled. And in exchange, I can tell you who's been trying to have you assassinated. Padme's eyes widened at that, and her mind reeled. How could he know that? Unless he was in league with them. At first she had thought it was Newt Gunray, but then the second assassin had come even after he died, and he wanted her to sign his treaty anyway. Someone else was sending assassins, deadly force using ones at that. Was it Dooku? Was he now threatening her? I assure you, Your Majesty, I knew nothing of the assassins until Obi-Wan told me of them. But now you claim to know who sent them. Dooku nodded. Padme stared at him for a long moment, not trusting him at all, but in the end he had been the one that saved her people from the Trade Federation. Whatever his involvement in the assassination, agreeing to his request now came at almost no cost to her, and any information he offered at all could be useful. We agree, she said, after a long pause. The men you call Chancellor Palpatine actually sent the assassins, and he's in league with an extremely powerful hidden sect on Coruscant. The claim was so ridiculous that Padme almost scoffed. Obviously Palpatine was ambitious, and more than willing to use this whole situation to his own advantage. It was when he explained to her just how long it would take for him to finally be elected and then bring the Senate to heel, that she realized the extent of his disloyalty. What would he even gain from killing her? He used her to convince the Senate to start a vote of no confidence against Chancellor Valorum. Chapter 75, The Queen Humbled 3. It was when he explained to her just how long it would take for him to finally be elected and then bring the Senate to heel, that she realized the extent of his disloyalty. What would he even gain from killing her? He used her to convince the Senate to start a vote of no confidence against Chancellor Valorum. She paused. Did Senator Palpatine really need her specifically to do that? No, what he really needed was a good cause for the vote to take place. If she had died, there was no reason to believe someone else couldn't be persuaded to push for it in her place, with all the more weight behind it for her being a martyr. Thinking about it further, if she was killed by the Trade Federation, and everyone else in her cabinet was captured as well, wouldn't Palpatine have been Naboo's acting head of state? There were a dozen names ahead of him in the line of succession, but if it hadn't been for Padme's own escape and survival, Palpatine would easily be able to call for the vote himself with all the moral and legal authority required. The senator was the one who had clearly benefited the most from this whole ordeal. This sect, are they likely to continue to pursue us? I cannot possibly say. Dooku replied. Presumably, you've served your usefulness to him, but then a second assassin chased you into the swamps despite that. It may be that you'll need Jedi protection for some time to come. Padme froze, thoughts of being plagued by Force-sensitive superhuman assassins for the rest of her life feeling all too plausible. A cold shiver ran down her spine at the idea. Perhaps you can persuade the Jedi Council of your needs, Yoda's coming here right now. Dooku told her, though his tone said he doubted it. Young Kenobi has proven himself very capable. You don't think the Council will listen to us? They certainly never listen to me. Dooku scoffed. Of course, if you find them as stubbornly blind as I did, then you can discuss the matter with me. The new temple is more than happy to provide permanent Jedi protection to worlds that need it. For a price, Count. Padme glowered at him. You offer us a Devaronian bargain. Of course not. Dooku replied. The new temple isn't a business, it's not run for profit. We seek to protect the outer rim. And the mid-rim as well, now. Only if you wish it so, Your Majesty. Padme considered. If there were going to be more assassins with the power of the Jedi chasing her, she would need a bodyguard to match. Hopefully the Jedi Council would be willing to see her need, but if they weren't, where else could she turn but to Dooku and his new temple? Not to mention more mundane threats. Her Naboo security services were in ashes, and their patrol fighter fleet destroyed. Pirates were known to occasionally penetrate this far into the mid-rim, and even the Gungans might make an attempt to drive the despised human population of Naboo off their homeworld if they thought they had a chance to do so. Not that the Gungans' military situation was much better than hers, but King Nass hadn't been particularly friendly before the occupation, and Padme doubted that would change much now that she'd used his people as cannon fodder. Count, there are other matters we would like to discuss before you leave. Dooku held up a hand to forestall her, looking back to the entrance. I hesitate to interrupt, Your Majesty, but it seems we have company. The doors to the hotel room opened, and in came Jedi Grand Master Yoda and Jedi Master Windu. The two of them stopped just in the doorway, both looking at Dooku in a way that would have seemed almost hostile if they weren't Jedi, to whom emotions like anger were supposedly alien. Padme felt as if she wasn't standing there, the yelling would have already started. Seemingly reading her thoughts, Yoda looked to her. Apologies, Your Majesty. Happy to see you in good health, I am. Celebrations are in order, for the liberation of your people. You honor me, Grand Master. Your former student's intervention has saved millions of our people from suffering. He has my gratitude, and through him we are grateful to you as well. To free our people, he has suffered a terrible loss of his own. Padme lowered her head to all three of the Jedi. We will always remember this. There was a pause as Yoda and Windu looked at each other, then at her. Your Majesty, the Order apologizes that it took so long for help to come. Master Windu said, before turning to Dooku. And sorry that it came at such a high price. Grand Master Dooku, if you would, we can retire to our ship and talk in private. With a dismissive curl of his lip, Dooku turned and bowed to Queen Amidala, showing his back to the other two Jedi. If you wish to discuss future security arrangements, you will always be a welcome guest at Sereno or the new temple. Then he walked out straight past the two Jedi Masters. Nothing to say to us, have you? Yoda said, turning to watch his student leave. Dooku paused in the doorway. He didn't look back at the Grand Master as he spoke softly. The Duke of Raxus once shared with me a tale about his younger brother, who was battling a terrible glitter stim addiction. Again and again, he would try to help his brother, paying for his rehabilitation and giving him chances and responsibility to prove himself. Every time, the brother would disappoint the Duke by misusing funds, enriching himself and feeding his own hunger. One day the Duke was ready to begin the cycle anew, when finally it was his younger brother who refused his help. He looked him in the eye and said wisely, if you still trust me at this point, whatever happens is your fault. Padme winced internally at that. And the funeral, Lord? Yoda asked. Will you not attend? I doubt I would be pleasant company. The door slammed shut as Dooku stalked away, the sound loud enough that Padme nearly flinched. She was now alone with the two Jedi Masters, but for Minla. He told us that there may be more assassins coming for our life, and that I should ask you for protection. Mace Windu replied. The Council thinks this is unlikely. Padawan Kenobi has debriefed us, and we've identified the second assassin as a mercenary named Aura Singh, a fallen Jedi Padawan. Though we've yet to identify the first assassin, we've since learned that he's targeted other Jedi Masters previously. We believe his targets were Padawan Kenobi and Master Jin. He likely hired Aura Singh to kill Kenobi as revenge for the injuries he sustained. Padme frowned at that. Count Dooku has informed us that Maul was sent by a hidden sect on Coruscant. And that our own Senator Palpatine is a part of it. Both Yoda and Windu exchanged a look at that. Certainly, Dooku may believe this. We, however, think this unlikely. The first assassin was from Dathomir. Most likely, the sect is there. It's possible they could be in contact with Senator Palpatine. Windu conceded. Of course, we will investigate this and find out who's really behind the assassination attempts. Our top investigator is already on it. And what of Padawan Kenobi? He'll be recalled now, won't he? After such an ordeal, Padawan Kenobi has earned his rest. Yoda answered with a nod. Padme supposed he had at that, but in the meantime it seemed the Count was right, she would have to make her own security arrangements. With his lip pulled back into a snarling grimace, Darth Sidious stalked through the Coruscant Undercity to his lair. Moving with surprising speed for someone of his age, his hateful shadow seemed to drive away even the rodents and predators of the Undercity. Human and alien alike each shied away from him fearfully, understanding by some instinct not to cross his path. He passed through the darkened streets into his hidden lair, where he bypassed his labyrinthine traps and security measures, before finally coming to his landing pad. Parked there was his own stealth ship, the Scimitar. The dark spirit that inhabited it felt excited to see him for the promise of violence he brought. Without any thought of the Sith guiding it, the ramp lowered. Going somewhere, Darth Sidious? A voice rang out. Sidious whipped around, surprised to see a pair of yellow eyes gleaming at him from the shadows. The tall, narrow form of the Mun emerged into the light, hood disguising his face and crinkling slightly at the neck where it bent around his breathing apparatus. This close to the election, you don't have time to waste. There's votes on the line. Plagueeyes chided. Sidious grimaced, and spat out. Of course, but the Count has gone rogue. He threatens to reveal our plans to the Jedi. He doesn't know our plans. But he knows my identity. Sidious snapped. If he tells the Jedi that, then the election may be lost on rumors alone. He was too proud to speak aloud the even greater threat of 10,000 Jedi attacking him at once. Any one he could defeat, even any dozen, but all of them. He must be silenced. Plagueeyes nodded. Even the best hyperdrive would take 48 hours to arrive at Sereno, or the new temple, then there would be the return journey. He won't wait for you at Naboo, and you can't disappear for so long. 2 days' absence could cost you the election, let alone 4. Isn't this what your pet is for? I've been retraining Maul. He's not in a fit state to defeat a Jedi Padawan, let alone Nemesis. Sidious was forced to admit none of the other assassins he might use would stand a chance against the Jedi Order's greatest duelist. Plagueeyes regarded his apprentice for a long moment. Then I will go. Sidious blinked in surprise. It had been years since Plagueeyes had willingly risked his own life, devoting his time almost entirely to research. You are right. Your assassins are not up to the task, and you are indisposed. This is a problem that must be dealt with. The Mun walked past him, up the ramp to the ship. I'll be borrowing this. Sidious nodded, smiling for the first time in what felt like days. Yes. Good. Good. At the top of the ramp, Plagueeyes paused and turned to face his apprentice. Don't be so pleased, Sidious. I will clean this up for you, but you were to be the one who would interface with him, not me, and now we have to replace an important cog in our plans at this late hour because of your mistakes. Internally Sidious seethed, burning with humiliation. Rather than reply, he turned and walked away, heading back to the Senate Tower. After some time he allowed himself to be relieved, and even pleased as a decision was made. Fate was on its way to meet any who dared declare themselves nemesis to Darth Sidious, the future Emperor of the Galaxy. He leant back into his chair, finally feeling resolved. Fate would be waiting here for Plagueeyes' return as well.